Destiny recently was on the Fresh and Fit podcast, and he debated Ukraine. And he debated Ukraine with a guy by the name of Ryan Dawson. Now, I don't know much about Ryan Dawson, outside of the fact that his fans are very energetic about the guy. They really like him. And the only reason I know that is as soon as I ever started talking foreign policy on the internet, I started getting some messages along with the line of debate Ryan Dawson. And I didn't know who Ryan Dawson was. I at first thought it was what's that guy? The one that sounds pretty messed up, but the guy that doinked the cat. You know, the guy, he was a very famous vlogger or YouTuber, and then he did something with a cat. It was very gross and got him canceled. That's what, at first, yeah, it was Shane Dawson. I first thought they were talking about Shane Dawson. So at first I was confused, but then I looked him up and I saw that he wrote a few books. I saw that I think he has some opinions on 9/11 that I don't know much about. But I never got any reach out from him. It was only his fans. And the last thing I want to do is, just go to some random person on the internet and start being like, hey, X fan and 2 fans hold me in every single YouTube video for the last month. I don't want to reward that type of behavior if you're going on every video and saying, debate this person. Now, if the person ever reached out to me and wanted to debate, I'd be happy to. But that's the only frame of reference I had in my mind for Ryan Dawson. I also remember seeing a tweet a few months ago where he tweeted about how peaceful it was in like Japanese stores. That's all I know about him. Outside of the fact that many people consider him to be a conspiracy theorist in reference to what I know I've heard about 9/11 that he believes, about possibly it being an inside job. But again, very low frame of reference, but I'm positive that I probably will disagree with his Ukraine opinions considering what I've heard from the grapevine. And people have been telling me to go watch this debate ever since it happened, because apparently it was a very good debate. Now, I'll be the judge of that. I'll watch it myself. Maybe it'll be an absolutely god-awful debate. But after hearing this guy's name just in my periphery for 3 years, I'm interested to see what he has to say. So anyway, let's get into it.
The facts are the facts. Why should that matter?
Oh my gosh. I have that sped up like crazy. And we don't need to watch the coming up section, do we? We could, whatever.
There's a lot of things to keep track of. Like that 14,000 figure of deaths you cited. I don't even know where that comes from. It's like a misciting of like the...
Oh, okay. I'll wait until they actually talk about the 14,000 number in the debate, but I always have something to say about the 14,000 number. That's a reference to an estimate of how many people died in the war in the east of Ukraine in the 8 years preceding the 2022 invasion. We can talk about that later when it comes up.
UNHCR report. That's not true. That 14,000 civilians have been killed. The fact that Russia didn't invade, that's not true. Spetsnaz and other special infantry were seen literally going when Russia called that snap 150,000 troops that they had collected on the eastern border for a distraction on February 22nd. That's not true. The idea that Russia would see what happened in Yugoslavia and Libya, that's not Russia. Why would NATO attacking those countries have anything to do with NATO attacking Russia?
I understand the Ukrainian point of view too. I mean, they suffered tremendously through Holodomor and then occupations by both the Soviet Union and the Nazis. And they saw a lot of their wealth transferred to ethnic Russians. They saw a lot of corruption.
You're gonna have countries like Finland that has air supremacy over Russia now because Russia doesn't have anything in the arsenal that can stand up to an F-35. That's why I think Russia
can carry nukes as well.
Yeah, well, so pretty much a B-52 can carry nukes. So this is kind of a misnomer. A B-1 can carry nukes, an F-117 can carry nukes, a B-2 can carry nukes, an F-16 can carry nukes, an F-15 can carry nukes, an F-18 can carry nukes. The thing is, it's the A modification. They can all carry nukes. Nukes are, it just means.
Yeah, a lot of aircraft can carry nukes. It depends on the size of the warhead, because a lot of, for example, what would be called tactical nuclear weapons can be deployed by a lot of, I mean, that could be deployed by an artillery gun. I know that's wild to think about, but you can actually deploy tactical, not intercontinental, like strategic nuclear weapons, but you can put a nuclear weapon in an artillery gun. You can launch it from like a truck. So yeah, you could technically, like the Finnish could also use an artillery gun to do it, if they had the material at their disposal. But there's a major difference between intercontinental ballistic world-ending nuclear weapons and tactical nuclear weapons, which are still unbelievably destructive to civilian populations, but they're not the same. We're watching the intro section. I shouldn't be talking. I should just let it go. But the last thing I want to do is be accused of stealing React content. We've seen how everybody's getting torn apart, all the React streamers. I got to make sure I contribute, or I'll be beheaded in the public Twitch square. Pwn3, thank you so much for the primer. I appreciate it.
It's a bomb that has a warhead with uranium, plutonium, and tritium.
What's your stance on the Russian-Ukraine conflict?
Yeah, I guess in the broadest of senses, from 1991, Ukraine has been a country that was recognized by everybody around the world. Fast forwarding through a lot of stuff, in 2014, there was an ousting of a leader. Some people call it a revolution. I think some people incorrectly call it a coup. In response to that ousting, Russia invades Crimea, and Russia begins to fund and back separatist movements. Ukraine refers to them as terrorists in the east, in the Donbass. And then from 2014 on to 2023, we've got basically military conflict that's been escalating. In 2022, the invasion happened, everything is subsumed under that actual invasion, and here we are today. I think that the broadest of senses, well, I'm sure we'll get into the details of all of this, I don't think that the initial Russian invasion into Crimea was at all justified. I don't think that
In
there
2014.
in 2014.
Okay.
Yep. I don't think that there's any evidence of any CIA coup or any sort of backing from the West showing that Euromaidan was artificially inflated by Western forces. I don't think there was any evidence that there was an actual coup d'etat. I don't think that the backing of separatist leaders in the East is good for anybody. It's not good for Ukraine. It's not good for the people that live there. It only benefits Russia if they can manage to peel away those separatist states and incorporate them into some kind of Russian federation.
Okay.
And I think that Russia is in the moral wrong basically from start to finish with this entire conflict.
So you don't think they had any real basis for invasion, whether it was 2014 or now?
Absolutely not.
What about, and just playing devil's advocate, and I'll turn it to Ryan.
I don't like that question, and I know I'm nitpicking here, but I have a weird feeling this might get tied up in semantics because these debates tend to. When we say like, listen to his question again there.
Whether it was 2014 or now?
Absolutely
One second, let me go back.
So you don't think they had any real basis for
any real basis? Like, of course, like anytime a country goes and invades any other country, they're going to have a basis as to why they're doing it. The question isn't if they have a basis to it. They can maybe say something like NATO expansion, or they could make like historical claims to the territory, right? Like the Serbians had a basis for like different actions they took in Kosovo. There was a basis for what the Japanese did in China. The question is whether it's a valid basis. I know I'm nitpicking, but I know how these debates go, and I just want to get that out quick, because I think it's going to get into a lot about like NATO expansion, stuff like that. So they have a basis as to why they did it. I just disagree with their basis. Like if we invaded Mexico tomorrow and our basis was we're sick of all these drugs, we're sick of all the crime, we're sick of the cartels, Mexican government isn't doing it, we're going to deal with it ourselves. We have a basis. I just think it's a really crap basis, and I don't think it's going to work.
invasion, whether it was 2014 or now?
Absolutely not.
What about, and just playing devil's advocate, and I'll turn it to Ryan here in a second. What about the fact that they were planning to invade the Donbass region in March?
Who's planning to invade?
The Ukrainians.
It's their territory. What do you mean invade?
Well, it's ethnic Russians that dominate that area.
It doesn't matter.
What does that mean? I mean, we have a lot of Spanish people in like a lot of areas of the country. We have, a lot of like Chinese people in Chinatown. Does that mean Chinatown, just because there's a lot of Chinese people there who speak Chinese, can now be its independent country? Not even talking about whether the local population wants that. I mean, we're Americans speaking English. We're English speaking Americans. That doesn't mean we want to be part of England. If you go to Ireland, they don't speak Irish there. They speak English there. Doesn't mean we want to be part of England. Whether or not the people locally speak Russian or Ukrainian does not necessarily determine their politics. First time I ever went to Zaporozhye, something that really grabbed me, and something I made note of and I wrote about with Offbeat Research in the publication I wrote on my first time in the forward operating position in Ukraine, in Zaporozhye, was that all of the local soldiers spoke Russian for the entirety of the time I was there. All the local territorial defense, people who had signed up, volunteered to go defend the city of Zaporozhye, where they were from. And so I think in American context, if we were able to say something like, well, if you look in America, like all these people speaking English, why didn't they side with the English or the British during the Civil War if they're all speaking the same language? That would be, we would think, wow, that's really simplifying the American Civil War. That's very stupid. That's silly. And that's what a lot of Western commentators do with Ukraine. For example, Azov, lot of Russian speakers in Azov. Azov, started out of Mariupol, had a lot of Russian speakers, right sector too. And these are some of the most die-hard Ukrainian nationalists you can find out there. And many of them come from Russian-speaking cities.
Ukrainian citizens.
Yeah, there's ethnic Mexicans that live in San Antonio, but if Mexico tries to invade, we would still stop them. It doesn't give them the right to invade just because people speak the same language.
You can't invade your own territory. It's their territory.
In fact, let's take this analogy further. The majority of people who live
kill 14,000 people in the Donbass.
Right, but the same. My point is,
but the Ukrainians. Okay, so we talked about the 14,000 number. So this is where I talk about the 14,000 number, and I don't want to repeat myself because this 14,000 number might come up again later. But I just want to say that the 14,000 number, there is a real number that is based off of 14,000 people dying in eastern Ukraine. But the Ukrainians didn't kill 14,000 people. That's unless, and this is how Russian state media talks about it. They just say Ukrainians killed 14,000 people in the Donbass. You'll hear something like, you know, Bombili Donbass, 14,000 killed in the Donbass. That number includes civilians on both sides. That means Ukrainian civilians that were killed by pro-Russian bombardment, pro-Russian separatists, and Ukrainian soldiers bombardment that were killed by, you know, Ukrainian artillery. That also includes both separatist soldiers, the people who are, you know, who are trying to separate from Ukraine, and Ukrainian soldiers. That includes everything. At every side, all sides, that's every single death related to the war. Meaning we would be pinning the deaths of Ukrainian soldiers, Ukrainian civilians, and the separatist soldiers, everyone, on the Ukrainian government, despite the fact that many of those people were killed by the separatists, which were supplied by the Russians. Why are we pinning that entirely on the Ukrainian government? Why are we taking every single death and attributing it to the Ukrainians and not fairly attributing each death to the nation that, you know, caused it? It's because it's a propaganda narrative. The 14,000 number is deceptive, and it's deceptively presented.
You don't have the right to do it just because those people, by the way, if Russia is giving them weapons.
To be clear, if we were to, this would be like if we said, like, we were talking about the Korean War and we took every single death and we just attributed it all to North Korea. That'd be extremely deceptive. Saying every single person that died in Korea were killed by the North Koreans, or saying, well, even if we were to say the North Koreans crossed, you know, they crossed the parallel, they're the ones who started the war, therefore we're blaming it on them, which is, by the way, not how this war started. It was in reverse, where the Russians invaded. So I would say, you know, the starting of this war was started by the Russians. It was in reverse. But even in that case, it would still be deceptive, because you're not talking about the American bombing campaign. You're not talking about the instances where American soldiers brutalized Korean civilians. It's deceptive. It's not only cherry picking. I think it's deceptive. I think it's purposely leaving out information about that number that makes it sound like the Ukrainian government just bombed and killed 14,000 civilians, which is not what happened.
And money to do so, then they fight back. Then the narrative becomes, look at what Ukraine is doing. They're killing all these people in Donbass. Well, then stop giving them weapons. That's the difference. If again, I'm going to use this example because, you know, a lot of people from this country, if Mexico started funding terrorists that live in San Antonio, Harlingen, and fucking Brownsville, the United States would do something to stop it. And then the news media would be like, do you see the Americans killing these Mexicans inside? No, at some point, if you attack, they get to attack back. And his argument is going to be sovereignty. My argument is even if there was a coup, the problem is they invaded.
Yeah, somebody brought up a much better example in Gutter Chat. It would be like saying that, like, attributing all the deaths in Vietnam to the Viet Cong. It's unbelievably deceptive.
They invaded Crimea. Invading Crimea doesn't make the populace more likely to be pro-Russian. It makes them less likely to be pro-Russian. Secondly, their parliament had almost unanimously agreed to trade agreements with the West. And their president, on the last second, switched sides and said, no, we're not going to take these trade agreements. And then that's where all these.
He's leaving out one piece of information here. By the way, I'm happy, whoever this is, I don't know who it is. I'm happy he's bringing this up because this stuff is usually not brought up. But he's forgetting the fact that he only reversed on his position, which he promised, we're talking about Yanukovych in 2012 on the campaign trail, to be in favor of entering the association agreement with the European Union, which would allow visa-free travel into Europe, would open up a lot of trade opportunities for Ukraine. He only reversed once the Russians tried to use economic coercion and strangle trade through the border, and Ukrainian trade was heavily dominated by Russia, so he seceded to Russian demands and reversed on a campaign promise. That's when protests started. That's when the violent response to protests was then delivered by the government through the Berkut and other security services, and the Tutushki hired thugs. And that only made the protests get bigger because the population was not happy with getting beaten upon, and decades of anger about corruption and Russian domination of Ukraine boiled up during Euromaidan. And then the protests and revolution happened. That's the general timeline.
These people started rioting. My point is, even if there was a coup, which he's going to say there's no evidence, but that's how the CIA works. They don't leave evidence. I'm still saying there's enough.
I mean, it's possible that somehow we've just dodged all of the evidence and found nothing, even though the Russian government has been trying to dig up anything they could for, like, I don't know, almost 10 years now, and they've invaded and taken over like 1/5 of the country, and they still don't have any real evidence for it. Like it's very hard for me to believe that this operation was done so widespread, caused so much chaos in the streets, and there's just like no paper trail. I mean, is it impossible? No, but you usually need some evidence to go off of. If not, then we could just like speculate about every event. Like, oh, you know, Biden lost the last election. Did the CIA make him win? Oh, I mean, Biden won the last election. Did the CIA make him win? When Donald Trump won at 16, was this an FSB opera? Like, you get what I'm saying. Like, you need something to go off of.
Enough reason for the people in Ukraine to not want to be a part of Russia after you understand what I'm saying? You bite my leg, maybe I don't want to be friends with you anymore. You take Crimea, maybe we don't want to be with Russia anymore. So his thing is, there's no evidence that there was a coup. My thing is, even if there was a coup, there was enough reason for the people in Ukraine to not want to join with Russia. That's my point.
Ryan, what's your stance and response to that?
Crimea was not annexed. That was a secession movement. And it's mostly ethnic Russians that live there anyway.
Even if, let's say I gave it to him that it was just a secession movement, which there were secessionists in Ukraine that wanted to leave, even if every single Crimean in Crimea said, we want to be part of Russia, and literally overtook the government buildings and just did it that way, it would still have to be annexed by Russia to become part of Russia. So it was annexed. So that's just the first thing. But also there's a lot of moments in that secession movement that is not talked about. I'll let him finish this thing, and then I'll talk about one of my favorite Russian celebrities who's in a little legal trouble right now.
Russia's not going to lose their base on the Black Sea, so they have every reason to back it. But invading how? It wasn't a military invasion of Crimea. Crimea left Ukraine.
They had troops in the Black Sea Naval Base, which was on lease to the Russian government. Then they took those soldiers, and then they marched them into Crimea and took over land. And they had other soldiers that were not wearing patches, who were the little green men, who also invaded and took over Crimea, which the Russian government's already admitted to, like, after the fact. So I don't even know why he's debating this fact. I mean, this point is, I don't know, this is not, I didn't really think this was debatable.
And
I see, this is what I mean by semantics. Like, oh, they didn't annex it. What, like, yes, they did. To take over the land, they would have to annex. They annexed this land. I mean, even if it was morally valid, they would still need to annex it to make it part of Russia. This is what I talked about earlier, that I feel a lot of these debates quickly slide into semantics.
And Ukraine did attack the Donbass, and probably Russia did back separatists.
What do you mean probably? The Russian agents were caught in the Donbass, and the Russian government had to admit to it after denying that they were deploying agents into the Donbass for a year after the separatist movement really took off in 2014 and started taking over government buildings. They denied it for a year. Then their agents got caught by Kiev, and they were, of course, the Ukrainian government showed the world like, hey, what is this? Then the Russians had to admit to it. So it's not really a probably, it's a, we know they were there. It's just a question to like, to what extent did they support them? Now, when you see a lot of the weapons that the rebels have and how they had them in pretty large supply, it's hard to believe that they didn't just, you know, get them from the neighbor that's right next to them that has endorsed their separatist movement, supports them, and has deployed agents out into the field of. Like, where did these weapons come from? They didn't just spawn from the sky, right? They didn't just like find one endless storehouse. You know that like Call of Duty Zombies game where they have the mystery box and they open and get a random gun. They don't have that in like Donetsk in some basement somewhere. That's not a thing they have. They would have to get the weapons from somewhere. And considering the Russian involvement in the country everywhere else and the type of weapons they're getting, which exactly match up with Russia has at its disposal, it's a foregone conclusion.
I think you have to go back before that. This was avoidable. And Zelensky's talking about the Belarus memorandum. I'm so tired. I can't remember.
The Belarus memorandum. I don't know what he
Flew
means.
here from Asia. Memorandum, which is about how they had to get rid of their nuclear weapons because they couldn't afford to maintain them.
That's not the Belarus memorandum. That would be the Budapest memorandum. I think he got his locations mixed up a bit there.
And it was kind of political blackmail to say, send us money, or we're going to reduce these weapons, but you're going to have to pay us to maintain them. Everyone agreed to get rid of nukes in that. Zelensky brings it up again. And that's a flex showing the Russians don't want a nuclear armed Ukraine on their border.
I don't like how he's presenting this here. I think this might become a theme of the conversation. So after the Soviet Union collapsed, a lot of the former Soviet states had gigantic nuclear stockpiles that they just kind of had. And they had to decide what to do with them, whether they were going to attempt to keep them and maintain them, which would be massively expensive. So what he's talking about here, about these stockpiles that they couldn't pay to maintain, that was probably true in the case of Ukraine. I mean, if they really wanted to, they could probably scrape together enough money to have funded keeping some nuclear weapons. If North Korea can do it, I'm pretty sure the Ukrainians could have found a way. But considering that the Soviet Union had just collapsed and any money that they could have possibly gotten from Moscow was basically gone, and they were re-entering the world and under this new gigantic privatization program, you know, the openness to the world, the openness to capitalism after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the corruption that was skyrocketing, and the lack of money for resources, and like whether it had to deal with the country's massive drug problem or lack of social programs or inflationary crises, it would have been very hard for them to budget it in. Not that it was impossible, but they had so many other things they had to spend money on that it made sense to most people at the time for them to give up the nuclear arsenal. Not only for the Ukrainians, which would have to budget for this, but for the West. We wanted to not see all these nuclear weapons in all these countries where they could possibly be siphoned off by maybe terror groups or having so many different actors with nuclear arsenals when we don't know what way exactly their government's going to go after the fact. And we wanted generally the Cold War states, the states that have, not the Cold War, the post-Soviet states, to give up its nuclear arsenals. We wanted that. The Russians wanted it as well. And so we negotiated the Budapest Memorandum, which basically stated that in return for giving up its nuclear weapons, and this is the part he didn't include, and I don't know why he wouldn't include this, but he also called it the Belarus Memorandum. So I don't know. I don't know how familiar he is with what he's talking about, but in the Budapest Memorandum, it specifically states that in return for Ukraine giving up its nuclear arsenal, which is of course a massively destructive weapon that is proven to be a good deterrent against invasion, that their territorial integrity would be respected, because that was one concern of the Ukrainians, is that, look, these weapons are very destructive. They could protect Ukraine. If we are going to give them up, we know we have these leverage in this nuclear arsenal. You got to give us some territorial guarantees. And so the Russians and the Americans came to the table, and I'm sorry I'm giving all this background, but I feel like he really butchered it here. The Russians and the Ukrainians and the Americans came to the table and negotiated a deal where Ukraine would give up its nuclear arsenal, and in return for giving up its nuclear arsenal, Russia and the United States would dedicate towards respecting Ukraine's territorial integrity and coming to its assistance if its territorial integrity was ever threatened. Russia, of course, would violate the agreement through its invasion of Crimea in 2014, through its sponsorship of the Donbass rebels for the last 8 years, and of course its invasion in 2022. And I would also argue in spirit that the Americans in a way disrespected the Budapest Memorandum by allowing that aggression to go on 8 years, generally unopposed with any hard power, any type of actual offensive, really powerful military aid to Ukraine to disincentivize the Russians pushing forward. There was never really like a line drawn anywhere, or even like a vague line. I remember Obama said in 2015, a year after the annexation of Crimea, that if Vladimir Putin went on to invade and conquer all of Ukraine, it'd be very difficult to rebuild our relationship with Russia. What does that mean? It'd be very... You might as well said, man, that's really problematic, Russia. That's an ick moment. That's ick. I'm very unattracted to you, Mr. Putin. Like, I mean, it's just such a weak statement. Anyway, I think he kind of butchered the retelling of the Belarus memorandum.
They know they're trained to NATO standards, and they don't want NATO expansion. They've seen what happened in Libya. They've seen what happened in Yugoslavia. And so I understand
I don't know why you would bring up Libya. I mean, I can kind of understand Yugoslavia. I don't know why he would bring up Libya, because Libya was not an instance of NATO expanding into Libya. It wasn't like, we're going to make Libya part of NATO, so we're going to invade Libya or conquer Libya. That's not what caused that. In fact, I don't even think it was a NATO operation. It was really, I think it was a bilateral operation, mostly led by, not really bilateral, but mostly led by the French and the Americans. And I believe Russia and China actually abstained in voting against the UN resolution to intervene in Libya. So the Russians could have stopped that intervention, at least giving it a UN endorsement. Maybe the French would have done it unilaterally, because it was actually, well, Hillary Clinton has talked about the most. It was the French who were really leading the way on the intervention. They didn't, and neither did the Chinese. So, I mean, they can, like, I don't know really how this relates to NATO expansion that much. Anyway, as for Yugoslavia, that was a NATO-led operation, but Yugoslavia doesn't have nuclear weapons. Russia does. So I don't know how we would engage in a bombing campaign in Russia to like respond to like ethnic cleansing and civil war while there's nuclear weapons. It would be very difficult for the United States to do that. There's also not an active civil war in Russia, so I think it'd be very difficult for us to do that. I don't know why he's bringing these two examples up. I don't know how these two examples particularly meant that they had to stop Ukraine from joining NATO.
And the Russians fear about this when they finally have a pro-Russian leader in charge that was going to accept the economic agreements that were favorable to the Russian state. You have to see they're walking into this 15 billion euros in debt.
Wait 1 second. Let me hear that again.
When they finally have a pro-Russian leader in charge that was going to accept the economic agreements that were favorable to the Russian state. You have to see they're walking into this 15 billion euros in debt. Ukraine's had corrupt governments from.
Let's be clear, though. He didn't run on accepting this economic relationship with Russia. He ran on entering the association agreement. And that's what was popular in Ukraine. And all the polling data coincides with that. And he then switched once pressured by Moscow, which caused a backlash amongst the civilian population, which then led into Euromaidan. So it wasn't like, you know, he was elected on a program of, hey, everybody, let's enter, you know, the Russian economic zone and distance ourselves from the European Union, because that was not the sentiment on the ground in Ukraine.
From the 90s to now, one oligarch after another. So there's a lot of people within the state that they were in favor of some sort of economic partner, either the Americans in the EU or the Russians. And obviously it's in U.S.'s interest for it to not be with the Russians. And Nuland and the rest of them were, when there was violence that both sides could take advantage of. So you had protests against the election results, and then you had counter protests. And the counter protesters were walled up in Odessa. I think 48 people burned alive.
What is he talking about? Okay, so he's talking about the trade fire in Odessa, but he just said there were counter protests to the election results.
Protests against the election results.
There was no election in 2014. That wasn't a thing. What is he talking? I mean, okay, wait. Election. I guess it was the election after. Would this be after Yanukovych was ousted? I think there was an election not earlier in 2014. I think it was later. The EU vote. Which election is he talking about? Let me just wait and try to listen to him more. Maybe I'll understand.
And then you had counter protests, and the counter protesters were walled up in Odessa.
The EU vote. Okay, 1 second. Let me just listen to him.
Odessa. I think 48 people burned alive. Mm-hmm. And that's insane. And when you look at Maidan, it's very similar to Syria with snipers shooting police and things. And so
snipers shooting police? What? I don't know what he's talking about. I think he might be talking about that one report that was made on there was a report made by one scholar that has not been peer reviewed that suggests that it was actually pro-Maidan snipers engaging in like terrorism, shooting the pro-Maidan protesters in order to cause a backlash. It has not been peer reviewed, and it has not been proven, and is not proven. So I don't know if that's what he's referencing, but I'm not familiar. I mean, when I think about the snipers, I think about the Heavenly 100.
People believe, there's foreign-backed separatists.
So would you? I guess. So you disagree with Destiny because he said
Justified to
they are
debate.
justified.
That's
The hell was that?
I guess. So you disagree with Destiny because he said
justified
Okay, so that was just the video. That was not me. Okay, I thought that was me. That's just the video.
to
They are
debate.
justified.
That's different than what he's saying. He's saying,
Yeah, no, he's saying that. I mean, we had all these issues.
there
I'm
is
explaining why they would say they did it.
Hold on. I think Destiny would understand there's a reason for them to invade. The question is, do they have the right to invade? And going back to what you're saying
Hold
before,
on, wait, real quick, because I would want to fight on almost every single one of those.
Okay. Can I say one thing real quick?
Yeah, go for
the
it.
president who went and took that friendly Russian deal, he agreed previously to not take that
We're gonna have a
Russian deal.
debate, and I don't have the internet. I don't think
That's true.
anyone else
Oh, I'm
should.
sorry. I just took notes. I apologize.
Wait, is he angry about him using the internet to Google things? Why would that matter? I mean, there's more tools at their disposal, but I mean, if somebody used the internet to Google that you were wrong about something, right? I feel like you should be more outraged at the fact that you were wrong, you were lied to, or you said something that was wrong than the fact that they had internet access. Like if I said on it, like remember when Matt Walsh was on Joe Rogan's podcast and he was asked, how many people do you think are transitioning every year? And he said millions, right? Millions of people. And then Joe was like, what? No, that doesn't sound right. And then they Googled it and it was like 1,000. It's like 1,000 people medically transitioned. So like was that unfair of Joe Rogan to be like, actually, I just Googled this and you're completely lying? If he didn't Google it, then they would have walked away from that, and the millions of viewers would have walked away from that thinking that millions of children were transitioning like every year, which is ridiculous. It's completely fanciful. It's just completely not true. But it's because people live in that bubble where people aren't fact checking them that you have so many people who thinks that there's just this like epidemic of transitioning kids all amongst you. And that's why the general public, when you look at independents, don't actually care that much about this. But if you look at the conservative base, they're really hyped up about it. It's because they're listening to commentators like Matt Walsh who are treating it like it's like kids transitioning is like one of the greatest threats to America. But in that moment, that bubble was popped with just the slightest introduction of reality introduced by that Google search. I would be more like upset about being wrong than about Googling, but whatever. I mean, I understand that he's facing down Destiny and the other guy, right? So that's two people who probably don't agree with him on Ukraine. So he might feel a little boxed in and doesn't want to like boxed in Googling everything he says. Like it might feel a little intimidating. I want to be somewhat sympathetic here.
To not take
we're
that
gonna have a
Russian deal.
debate, and I don't have the internet. I don't think anyone else
Oh, I'm
should.
sorry. I just took notes. I apologize.
I was gonna say,
I can stop doing it. Anyway,
like, just get rid of phones.
Yeah.
the point is that,
Wait. The facts are the facts. Why should that matter? There's a lot of things to keep track of. Like that 14,000 figure of deaths you cited. I don't even know where that comes from. It's like a misciting of like the UNHCR report. That's not true. That 14,000 civilians have been killed. The fact that Russia didn't invade. That's not true. Spetsnaz and other special infantry were seen literally going when Russia called that snap 150,000 troops that they had collected on the eastern border for a distraction on February 22nd. That's not true. The idea that Russia would see what happened in Yugoslavia and Libya, that's not Russia. Why would NATO attacking those countries have anything to do with NATO attacking Russia?
February 22nd is not what I was talking about with Crimea.
They're not what?
February 22nd is the hot war from last year.
In 2014, I'm talking 2014.
So
Oh, that was the same date, actually.
On,
Yeah.
on 2014, there was a Russian invasion. There were Russian troops that went through Sevastopol that were dropped off. There were Spetsnaz, there were special forces, the little green men, the election that they held afterwards, the locking of the checkpoints to the north. Like you agree.
You
like
don't
even
agree
Putin
that
doesn't
you
deny
think that election was just a farce, rigged?
I don't know if the election was a farce.
Wait, I'm looking it up because people are talking about the election. The election in Ukraine was May 25th. and the trade union fire was before that. So I guess it might have been a protest before the election in relation to all the instability. Yeah, it was because it was pro-Russian and pro-Ukrainian forces kind of clashing in the city. Whatever, it's a very minor point. Doesn't really matter.
But I do know that the election was held. There were reports.
Also, I would recommend people go read the UN report on the trade union fire, because I think there's a lot of disinformation flowing around online about it. And I don't really want to go off and read the whole UN report, but I would recommend just people go read the UN report.
Of intimidations on the ground by the little green men, and that there was a report that I think 97% of those people ended up supporting separating and joining Russia, and that election.
Did Destiny talk to me before this debate? No, he did not.
Held, there were reports of intimidations on the ground by the little green men, and that there was a report that I think 97% of those people ended up supporting separating and joining Russia, and that election wasn't allowing any independent observers whatsoever. Are you asking me if it was rigged? I don't know. Do I trust it? Absolutely not.
The other issue is,
I mean, there were large-scale allegations of ballot stuffing. The election monitors they did bring in were mostly from pro-Russian individuals all around the globe. A lot of far-right parties were brought in to do election monitoring. I don't know if I would, for example, bring in far-right political parties to election monitor my elections. I probably would bring in election monitors, you know? Not to mention, it's impossible to have an invasion that quick, have all the people start fleeing, because a lot of people did flee, and then engage in the campaign of suppression, which Russian forces did do in Crimea, arresting and murdering Tatar activists and otherwise, and think that there's going to be a political environment where people feel like they can freely voice their opposition to annexation, considering the disappearances, considering the torture, considering the campaign of terror that the Russians engaged in Crimea to those who opposed the Russian invasion, especially the Tatar community. So it's hard for me to believe that even that environment could be could be productive towards democracy, but also it was blatantly rigged.
As the president in 2014, he passed anti-protest laws, and right before he doesn't take those favorable trade relations.
Wow, I don't know who this guy is, but he's somewhat on point here. It is true that during the end of the Euromaidan protest movement, Yanukovych did try to outlaw protesting, which did not make everyone go home. It did not work. He tried to make it so no group of more than 3 people could gather across the country.
With EU, he switches his position. So when you're saying, like, my point is, he wasn't the whole time he was pro-Russia. Right before, everyone was surprised when he went ahead and voted for the pro-Russian package. And that's the reason why it makes me even less think, you're saying maybe he's corrupt. That doesn't fit with the CIA plot. The point is, there's that many people protesting. Their parliament is almost entirely in agreement with joining with EU, and they've already had part of their country taken away. You're saying that they separated, that's fine. But if I'm a Ukrainian, I still don't like the fact that Crimea is part of Russia. It doesn't make me want to.
Also, can I just say, if it was a separation, a peaceful separation of just no annexation, if we just disregard what the word annex means, what was Igor Girkin saying when he said publicly that when he was the former defense minister for Donetsk region, for the Donetsk separatists. So this isn't like some nobody. He was involved actively in the secession process, especially in the early days. He said that they held the Crimean politicians at gunpoint and made them dissolve the parliament. When he said that, was that just like, he's just like joshing people? Was that just like peaceful transition? Was that democracy? It's just, again, it's always interesting what information someone does present and doesn't present in a conversation about the war. And I think it can say a lot about people's intentions, even though, again, I would never tell somebody to assume someone's intentions.
To vote for Russia. It doesn't make me want to join with Russia. That's the issue that I have. What I'm saying is, he's saying there was no CIA plot. I'm saying if there was a CIA plot, I don't think it makes any fucking difference. I think it would be the same thing either way. I think they're in a situation where you've lost part of your country, and the parliament has voted to join with favorable trade agreements with the EU, and then all of a sudden your president one day decides to not do it, and then there's a huge riot, and the president has to leave the country. And where does he go? Where does he go when he leaves the country? Everybody? he goes to Russia. That's where he escapes to. So that's
Also, here's another thing about the Crimean referendum. Somebody just brought this up in Guttershed, and I do need to mention it. There was no option for Crimea to go back and join Ukraine again. That wasn't an option during the referendum. How is this a peaceful secessionist movement where everybody gets a choice when from the get-go you can't choose to go back with Ukraine? What does that mean if you're a pro-Ukrainian person living in Crimea? What do you vote for? Why participate? And that's why they didn't participate.
that's my issue, right? I'm just trying to play devil's advocate here. Go ahead.
Ryan, you have anything back to that?
Yeah, as far as the anti-Russian sentiment started long before Crimea. They heroicized Stefan Bandera and others, which was reversed in 2010. But you have to see how the Russians are looking at that when they are heroicizing Nazis from the past. And then,
I mean, I don't want to get into the nitpicking of like, I mean, it isn't nitpicking, but I could just like, what is the UPA? Talk about collaboration, right? Talk about the time, the SS collaboration, and then the fighting against the Germans and the Soviets. That doesn't really matter. I don't want to get into the historiography about talking about Stefan Bandera. It's honestly not worth it. What is worth it though is how little this fucking matters. And I'm not trying to whitewash the UPA or any of the massacres they did in Poland or anything like that. I have no interest in doing that. But if the United States was invaded by China, okay, let's say that Xi Jinping said, I'm sick of these Winnie the Pooh memes, or, you know, I'm sick of not being able to party with Hunter Biden and snort all the coke that I want. We're going to invade America for whatever reason, right? I know it's a ridiculous scenario, but as Americans, it's very hard for us to relate to war. You know, it's a very abstract kind of distant thing that you can kind of turn on and off at will when we're drone striking or having bases occupy another country, because it doesn't really affect our daily lives. We don't have a stream of coffins coming back from our counterinsurgencies. It's only really a dribble. And so like the type of war that Ukrainians are facing, Americans just have no frame of reference for, period. We don't. To see that type of destruction on a home front. So the only way I can try to make you relate to what's happening in Ukraine when we were talking about Stefan Bandera is to bring up this silly example. So I'm very sorry, but I have to do it. So China lands and they occupy, you know, Washington State, California, Hawaii, of course, all the Pacific Islands, and they're marching inland. And then you as an American hear the Chinese say, we're fighting to destroy the evil racist Americans. You know, they have monuments in DC towards people who owned human beings. The previous president had a poster of Andrew Jackson on his wall, the slaughterer of Native Americans, a genocider, who also was pro owning other human beings. Obviously, this evil, racist KKK Klan America must be fought. Now, obviously, when we redefine it and we talk about our own historical figures who have also done very bad things in the past in this context, it's very silly to think about going to war over something like that or using it as a justification. You can have this type of historical debate and like talk about the evils done by historical figures, but no way does Stefan Bandera or his imagery in Ukraine at all make it so the Russians have a right to invade Ukraine or really support their argument at all. Definitely, because in this context, it's hard for me to think that they're fighting a war against Nazism when they're also having Nazi militias fight for them. Let me give you guys a fantastic example. I don't know if you guys are all familiar with Rusich, but Rusich is a neo-Nazi militia that is fighting for the Russian military in Ukraine, has been fighting since 2014. So this isn't somebody that they got desperate and they had to use the Nazis. Since the start of the invasion of Ukraine, ever back since 2014, they have been fighting with Nazis. And by the way, when I say these are Nazis, I mean the leader of this organization, when asked about his politics, said, don't call me a nationalist. Don't call me a patriot. I am a Nazi. I am a Nazi. That's what he said. You can go look it up if you don't believe me. You can look it up right now. That's what it'll say. That's not even talking about Dmitry Utkin and his far right ties. It's just when it comes to Stefan Bandera and it comes to Nazism in this war, I believe it's mostly just a political tool. Slavs hate Nazis for good reasons. Nazis killed Slavs. So if you can make your enemy the Nazi, it's going to be easier to demonize them and then invade and kill them. That's why a lot of times you'll see messages online, at least in my experience, of Russians when like Ukrainian civilians die, like, haha, another Nazi dead. I've seen a lot of that type of commentary in like Russian social media, Russian telegrams. And I think it's because it's in a sense being used to dehumanize the Ukrainian population. They're Nazis, they're evil, they're disgusting. So what happens to them is just, you know, what happens to them. Recently, we covered on this channel a Russian Orthodox TV channel that was talking about slitting the throats, that the Ukrainians are pagans, so we cannot use New Testament ethics with them. We have to go to the Old Testament. We have to treat them like they're pagans and go cut them by the throats. That type of commentary, while not raging constantly on every Russian TV channel, there's always some amount of racism or demonization going on. That type of extreme commentary is sadly being more and more and more normalized. And so, sorry I kind of rambled a little bit about this, but Stefan Bandera, Nazism, I think has very little to actually do about this war. It has very little directly to do with the geopolitics behind this war at all.
Banning the Russian language and taking steps.
You're talking
Russian language was never banned. Again, that's deceptive. The Russian language was never banned. They're when we talk about the language laws, yeah, I'm sorry. This is Ryan. This guy, I don't know. He kind of, people hyped him up in my comments for a bit, so I don't know. I mean, we're just in the first 10 minutes. Maybe it'll pick up later, but we'll see. And he's saying he's tired, so I'll give him some slack here. But there was no ban of the Russian language. There was a language law which stated that in public buildings, you had to speak Ukrainian first if you're a public employee, and if the person speaks either Russian, then you can switch over to Russian. So let me give you an example. Let's say you walk into like a public service location. I don't know, their version of a DMV to get your driver's license. You walk up, they'll say "Dobra," they'll introduce in Ukrainian, and you say "Da" back, and then they can switch into Russian because you've requested to speak in Russian. That's what the law stipulated. Now, you can disagree with it. You could say it's overbearing. You could say that, it's silly, or you don't think that you should nitpick public employees' language like that. But this isn't that radical from what many other countries have done in their nation when they have like a state language and they try to encourage their language and try to protect their language. And definitely when we talk about Ukrainian, which has historically been persecuted and banned under the Russian Empire, and people are being treated pretty badly in occupied territory for speaking Ukrainian. And there have been reports from Ukrainian children that have come home. Now, of course, these are just reports. We don't have any videos of this, of Ukrainian children talking about how them speaking Ukrainian was discouraged when they were detained by the Russians. But putting all that aside, there is no ban on the Russian language. You can still speak Russian in Ukraine. Most of the soldiers that I've interacted with in Eastern Ukraine spoke in Russian. So if you can speak Russian in the Ukrainian military, it's kind of hard for me to believe that it's banned.
in Ukraine, they're banning the Russia. Okay, because you said the Russian. Sorry. Yeah.
Well, yeah, this war has really disturbed me in the sense of how anti-Russia has gotten, where anything Russian, even the Paralympics, athletes, musicians, are being banned because they're Russian, which I think that's reminds me of after September 11th, there was a lot of anti-Muslim sentiment or even just Arab. And so actually worse than that, even if you're a Sikh from India.
You know what? When I look at this war, I see all the death and all the destruction and all of the, villages that have been reduced to rubble in Ukraine. The first thing I think about is, Russian athletes. I'm not saying I don't at all agree that I think somebody is just Russian and they get treated like shit just for being Russian. Obviously that's bad, but it's probably not the first thing I would think of when I think about how disgusting and depressing this war is. I'd probably think of the death, the destruction, the soldiers getting castrated, the soldiers getting beheaded, the soldiers getting executed, the mass graves getting uncovered, the children being kidnapped. the accusations of sexual violence being used as a weapon of war, the deliberate targeting of civilians and aid workers, the flooding, which has killed thousands upon thousands of animals and done ecological damage and drowned the elderly and the disabled in their homes. Like, these are the things that make me depressed most about the war. I'm not saying that there isn't any sympathy to be had for Russians who might be caught in the crossfire, who are unrelated to the war, not supporting it in any way. Just not the first thing I would name personally.
Or something. You look Arab. You know, there's a lot of ignorance going around.
Doesn't that remind you of Germany when everything was being banned? Anything German was being banned.
Well,
doesn't this remind you of Nazi Germany? Because people are protesting Russian athletes, and Ukrainians at the Olympics don't want to shake their hand. And the Jews didn't invade and conquer a country in Poland that didn't have the whole. You know what? I'll just let him respond.
Yeah, it's similar.
Also, there's no like camps for Russians. There's no like it's illegal to speak Russian, you know. There's no like whatever.
But you know, you would think this isn't this is 2022, 2023.
Yeah.
To ban all things Russian, to have so much hate, so much of a lopsided media.
It's not banned. All things Russian aren't banned.
Yeah. And this is before.
I'm in Ukraine. Watch this. Привет. Hope the SBU doesn't get me.
For Elon.
I understand there's a cultural backlash to things Russian, but there was also a cultural backlash to things American after the American intervention in Vietnam. Like these, I'm not saying that in all instances it's fair. I'm sure if I was alive during the Vietnam War and somebody was like, fuck you, American, like, obviously I probably didn't deserve that. You know, I didn't do anything to favor the war. I voted for whoever the other guy was, you know. I voted third party, right? I voted for the Communist Party USA candidate or whatever. No, I didn't do that. But I mean, the bigger outrage to me is the war in Vietnam. And this is something that happens anytime a big country invades a smaller country and it gets international backlash. People start looking at the big country in a very, very negative light. As much of the international community reacted to the American intervention in Vietnam. So, I mean, it sucks for the individual Russian. I don't know, again, wouldn't be my first major complaint about the war.
So Twitter was just hardcore left. All the social media, we're coming out now with all these different Twitter files and information on how many spooks were all over all these sites and why people are getting censored. So I don't feel like we're getting
as far as I know, the Twitter files did not reveal a bunch of government-run CIA accounts. I don't remember that as part of the Twitter files.
Massive information.
But there's some stuff we do know. Like, for instance, 2 months before the invasion, Vladimir Putin said there was not going to be an invasion. And from a statecraft or from a military standpoint, that was a good move. But from a diplomacy standpoint, after the war, do I ever want to sign a treaty with Russia? If they're willing to lie about an invasion like that, do you see the problem?
Well,
what I'm saying is some of it, they're bringing it on themselves.
Let's be clear. They didn't lie about the invasion once. They lied about invading Crimea in 2014. They lied about supplying the separatists in 2014 to 2015 until their agents started getting caught. And even past then, they still denied the lion's share of their support to the separatists. And they continued to do it for 8 years. And then 2022, they lied again about invading. And that's not even talking about them lying when they signed the Budapest Memorandum. And they agreed that they would not invade Ukraine and they would respect Ukraine's territorial integrity. Or maybe he also lied again. Actually, not maybe lied. He definitely lied again in 2008 when talking about the invasion of Georgia, when everyone was scared after the Russians invaded Georgia and conquered a bunch of land, Abkhazia, Ossetia, that area, South Ossetia. He was asked about Ukraine because people were like, are we going to see you invade Ukraine next? And Putin said in an interview, no, there is no ethnic issue in Ukraine. There is no ethnic issue in Crimea. 6 years later, he's invading Crimea on these ethnic issues that just 6 years ago he said didn't even fucking exist. So it is hard for me to believe that Vladimir Putin is the most good faith actor when it comes to this war. That is true.
Go ahead.
George C. Marshall Strategic Studies Institute, almost half of Zelensky's cabinet's coming from that. Is seeing a lot of people around him. Ihor Kolomoisky sends him $41 million. There's a lot of corruption in Ukraine. And so it's almost a mafia state, has been since the 90s.
Okay. I don't even know what to say. I mean, out of all the examples he could have used to talk about Ukrainian corruption, he talks about people around Zelensky being from... Can we hear that again?
It's coming from that. Is seeing Strategic Studies Institute.
Comes from the Strategic Studies Institute. Is that really the best display of Ukrainian corruption? Can we talk about racketeering or other, whatever? Okay, whatever. Because I think the racketeering of the Berkut, which was happening before the Berkut was abolished, one of the big examples of how people would point to corruption in the Ukrainian police force, that I think was an example of mafia state-esque behavior, because that is the police engaging in racketeering, right? I don't know if a bunch of people being from the same institute is an example of corruption, or the best example of corruption at the very least, to display that it's a mafia state. Because if that's the case, if we could just say all these people came from the same schools, then let's just look at all the world leaders that came from Yale. Okay, I don't know, just not the best example. There has been a lot of corruption in Ukraine. It's not as bad as it used to be, but it's still an issue. I saw some issues about a local corruption in the rebuilding of a building in Bucha recently that really disgusted me. It's still an issue, not as bad as it used to be, but I don't think that's the best example.
Almost half of Zelensky's cabinet's coming from that. Is seeing a lot of people around him. Ihor Kolomoisky sends him $41 million. There's a lot of corruption in Ukraine. And so it's almost a mafia state, has been since the 90s. So Russia's looking at that as these people are easily bought and paid for. And they were afraid of having Western weapons and military troops on their border.
We can agree on that, yeah. And that, because that's what happened in Finland. And
Just
we
to
can talk
stay
about that
focused real quick. Do you have anything to refute what Destiny was saying? Because
I mean, whether or not they were scared of Western troops in Ukraine being in Ukraine on their border, first off, if that was their main fear, which was one of the fears that you suggested when they announced the war, outside of the nationalistic rhetoric and denying Ukrainian existence, etc., the war of cultural annihilation, if that's the case, then this war has been a tremendous failure on every front, because they doubled the border with NATO by Finland joining. And when Sweden joins, I mean, the Baltic Sea becomes not necessarily the NATO Sea, but gets a lot closer to being the NATO Sea, right? With the Baltic states, Finland, Sweden, Denmark, I mean, Germany, it's not looking great. So first off, I would say it's a tremendous failure. But the thing that really gets me about this threat of NATO troops is that there was a concession made after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which was basically that and it was stated multiple times by politicians constantly, that a nation with a territorial dispute, an active territorial dispute, cannot join NATO. And this was put out again and again and again in the media by American officials, by NATO officials, by German officials, French officials, to basically say that after the Russians invaded Crimea, Ukraine's not joining NATO, at least until all of this stuff with Russia is resolved. And for the next 8 years, it wasn't. And so leading up to the 2022 invasion, there was no path forward for Ukraine to join NATO. The French didn't want Ukraine to join NATO. The Germans didn't want Ukraine to join NATO. It's hard to believe the Hungarians would want the Ukraine to join NATO. The Turks hadn't necessarily signed on to it, as far as I'm aware. So you combine the fact that you hadn't signed up all the NATO states onto Ukraine joining NATO, that's the first thing, on top of the fact that this territorial dispute basically put it in permanent deadlock until it was resolved. I think the amount NATO expansionism played towards the Russian invasion of Ukraine is overemphasized at the very least, considering that they're successfully, the Russians have put a pin in Ukraine joining NATO in the immediate future.
Yeah, I disagree with some of your points.
Well, I'd also add, if you want to refute things, the Russian language was never banned. That's completely not true. Stepan Bandera it's weird that we selectively bring up like neo-Nazis on both sides, or on the Ukrainian side, when I think you could find like neo-Nazi ties to the other side as well. Pavel Gubereva, I can't pronounce any fucking names.
Who's he talking about?
But this is the guy that called himself like the first leader of the Donbas People's Militia. Like that guy explicitly came from a neo-Nazi group. It was founded by Alexander Barkashov, who also came from a far-right nationalist.
I don't know about his pronunciation. My pronunciation's bad, so I'm terrible with names. And then combining that with Destiny's bad pronunciation, I don't know who exactly he's talking about, but I can confirm, as we talked about earlier, and I just showed Rusich as an example. He's bringing up a different example, that there have been Nazis, Russian neo-Nazis, in the separatist far-right Russian nationalist circles fighting actively on the ground, being Russia's eyes and ears on the ground during the invasion, during the fighting in the east of Ukraine for the last 8 years, 9 years. It's been like that for a while now.
Group. Like the idea that neo-Nazis only exist in Ukraine, when Pew Research polling data shows that Ukraine is one of the most welcoming countries in the entire world for Jewish people, when they've had like 2 Jewish heads of state, the only other country in the world besides Israel to do so. I don't think that like finger waving over potential neo-Nazism in Ukraine that also just happens to align with Russia's primary propaganda vehicle, which is that they're fighting Nazis. That's too convenient, and there's too little evidence to actually support that.
I just want to go ahead. Sorry, Ryan.
I don't think the Nazis in Ukraine are the like anti-Semitic Third Reich, like a lot of people paint them out to be. They have the same
No, they're the Jew-loving Nazis. Yeah, of course.
symbols. You know, there's some swastikas and things, but the Bandera movement and the Nazi movement that
Burns
they
is a
heroicize and
immoral,
build statues of
morally
these people
corrupt,
wasn't about.
man.
It's the same. It's not the same as Hitler putting people in camps.
Stefan Bandera was also a anti-Semite. I don't know. I mean, he didn't. I don't know if Stefan Bandera's like
Burns is
primary
a
motive
immoral,
was to eliminate
morally
all the
corrupt,
Jews. I don't believe
bankrupt
that was his
man.
primary motive. But I mean, he was also a pretty notorious anti-Semite. Dirky Dirk 69, thanks for the tier 1. Poggy 84, thank you for the tier 3 in gutter chat. My goodness, you're a slumlord over there for 15 months. Dylan's been watching. Dylan's been watching the videos on channel, and my God, the eyeliner the editor gives you really. Gotta stop editing eyeliner in all my videos and all my video thumbnails. It's very, very damaging to my manly image.
It was more of an anti-Russian more than anti-Jew.
Correct.
It's
They wanted to ethnically cleanse that part of the country.
Excuse me.
Sorry. No, you can
Well, Steph. Okay, I thought they were talking. I thought he was talking about the Ukrainian government for a moment.
say it.
I can't. Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah.
But then call it something else. Don't call it. If you want to address something in Ukraine, don't say the neo-Nazi Ukrainian movement. If it's not anti-Semitic, if it's pro-Jew, or it's okay with Jews, right, or potentially okay with homosexuals, potentially okay with any of this. By the way, my experience with right sector, not very pro-gay, I can say at the very least. And the right sector PR people right now are like lambasting the progress Ukraine is seeing on LGBT issues. Then don't call it neo-Nazism. Like there's no such thing as like a ambivalent towards the gays, ambivalent towards the Jews, ambivalent. Like at this point, I mean, how is that Nazism? I mean, anti-Semitism is pretty essential to Nazism. Just call it like ultranationalism. Just say Ukrainian ultranationalism. That would be one of the more accurate descriptions, because that has its own problems too. But then when you call it Nazism, you're just playing, I think, largely into Russian propaganda narratives.
But I understand it. I understand the Ukrainian point of view too. I mean, they suffered tremendously through Holodomor and then occupations by both the Soviet Union and the Nazis. And they saw a lot of their wealth transferred to ethnic Russians. They saw a lot of corruption during the whole Soviet era. And so they legitimately have, beef. The problems with that thinking, obviously, though, is Russia also suffered under communism, and Russian people also starved, just like Holodomor, from the same leadership. You don't blame the ethnicity for what a government did. But
well, when we say Russians also starved, things like the Holodomor caused very specific damages to like Ukraine and Kazakhstan. Like even today, when we talk about Eastern Ukraine is full of ethnic Russians and Crimea is full of ethnic Russians, that's specifically because crops were requisitioned from starving Ukrainians that were like defending their families from cannibals who were being shot in the back as they tried to flee their villages. And then once, what was it? Is it 3 to 5 million? I think Ukrainians died in the Holodomor, maybe more.
No, like 11.
There might have been.
But also, like, if you're like a Tatar person who had your people forcefully relocated by the Russian government, by Stalin's regime, specifically told that you're getting moved because of your ethnicity, because your group, the Tartar group, is seen as unloyal to communism, that they were quote unquote Nazi collaborators, then killed a bunch of them, and then forcefully ethnically cleansed them from the peninsula. Like, it's not the fault of all Russians, but when we talk about the people of Ukraine and the people of the Crimean Peninsula, their identity has also been weaponized against them by primarily Russian-dominated Muscovite leadership. And, I mean, not to even talk about the reversals on, like, the more sovereignty and autonomy that was happening in a lot of the Soviet Union under Lenin. Of course, I'm not saying Lenin is perfect, but I'm saying that there was a lot more autonomy under Lenin that was stripped away under Stalin. And he basically tried to centralize not only control over himself, but tried to make it so that he could dominate these states with the Russian language in order to have better control of them. To centralize education systems, to centralize a whole bunch of stuff, to take away that autonomy. And that's what happened. So it's not the fault of every Russian, yeah? But a lot of Russians have a historical blind spot when it comes to Stalin's crimes. In fact, the majority of Russians, from recent polling data that I've seen, view Stalin, I think, majority favorably. Ukrainians, the number's like 4% that view Stalin favorably. So there's a big divide on this history.
Been 11 million. Then afterwards you have, and then Kazakhstan too, not even doing that. Then you're bringing in a bunch of ethnic Russians afterwards to Russify the country, to use that excuse, you know, later on and say, well, there's a lot of ethnic Russians there, therefore we ought to respect that there are ethnic Russians there. Yeah, I don't think.
Do you guys understand what he's talking about? Joseph Stalin like starves out a bunch. The reason why there's so many ethnic Russians, Russian speaking, you understand, Ukrainians don't speak Russian. There's two different languages there. Some of them speak both. But what he's talking about before was
a decent amount of Ukrainians do speak Russian in the same way that a lot of Irish people do speak English. It's just the history of that relationship with language affects your language, but that doesn't necessarily make you like pro-Russian. I just wanted to clarify that.
during Stalin, they needed to take the crops from Eastern from Ukraine and then use that to feed their own army.
Troops.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then when those people tried to escape, then they just shot them in the back. And then what happened was Russia started filling that area, and they both agree on this. They started filling that area with Russian speaking people. Mm-hmm. It's not their fault. The people that are there now that are Russian, it's not their fault. But just like I would say before,
well, a lot of Russians in Russia also starved, also had
for sure. We can agree Stalin was a piece of shit. How about that? But my point is, when we go back, you said something before about the nuclear weapons, giving up the nuclear weapons. First off, it's not Ukraine's fault that they had nukes. That was the Soviet Union who gave it to them. And number two, when they agreed to get rid of their nukes, it was the United Kingdom, the United States, and Russia who all agreed to accept the boundaries of Ukraine. And so
they were supposed to get.
By the way, the Russian government accepted the boundaries of Ukraine. And I just want to say this again. I said this earlier, but I just want to emphasize this again. Not only then, but Putin also accepted those borders again in 2008 when he said there was no ethnic issue. And then, once the political situation in Ukraine was no longer favorable towards the Russians, that's when they switched around. Oh, you're not going to join our economic agreement. You're not going to be strong-armed out of it. Oh, the government has actually been rejected by the people due to the fact that you are caving to my strong arming. Okay, forced my hand, we're moving in, right? 6 years later, after that commitment in 2008 was made, immediate reversal. So it wasn't just the Budapest Memorandum, but Putin's government as well, because some people will say, well, you know, that was a while ago. 2008, not that long ago. Russia had the same leadership. Was he lying then? Or did something change?
Security promises. If they're
sure.
going to get rid of the nukes that they can't afford to maintain, then that's going to come with certain.
By the way, let's go back to the can't afford to maintain thing, because when we get to the World War III thing, we're going to discuss that. Okay.
Well, also, I think you guys should resort, because that is important.
Yeah.
In 94,
this is
that
what they
Budapest
say.
Memorandum guaranteed them, you said security assurances that we're not going to fuck with you, but could you please give your weapons essentially back to Russia?
And they did. And you were saying like blackmail, but one more thing. Well, the point I'm trying to make is they didn't make the nukes. Russia gave Ukraine the nukes during the world, when the fall, you have the invasion of.
Also, I don't remember if I mentioned this earlier about the nukes. If you're Zelensky, and this is something that people say was like a provocation on the side of the Ukrainians, but it's really ridiculous on its face. I think a few months before the invasion happened, Zelensky brought up the fact that Ukraine had given up its nuclear arsenal and had gotten in exchange security guarantees for their territory, and that the Russians went back on that. And so he suggested at an international conference with a bunch of European leadership, if the Russians went back on their side of the agreement, why wouldn't the Ukrainians be able to go back on their side? Basically suggesting that, why wouldn't we then be able to renuclearize? Like, they don't respect our side, why would we respect ours? That wasn't a statement that they were going to do it. It was them basically pointing out that, look, we made a commitment. You guys made a commitment. The Russians made a commitment. And they went back on it. But we stick to our commitment. Why should we if no one's going to help us out here? That wasn't a threat to renew. That wasn't like, oh, we're going to renuclearize. We're going to do that. It was pointing out the obvious hypocrisy of Ukraine being held to a double standard compared to the Russians. And then the Russians used that in part to try to justify their invasion, saying that the Ukrainians were making nuclear threats against them. It was ridiculous.
Afghanistan, then you have Chernobyl, and you have it becomes incredibly expensive. Then you have perestroika.
Oh, not to even mention the fact how funny it is the Russians will be complaining about nuclear threats. Anyway, sorry, I'll let it continue. I'm being a super pause Andy right now.
And you have Chernobyl, and you have it becomes incredibly expensive. Then you have perestroika. The whole country falls apart. They start giving off the satellite countries, and they don't get back the nukes. So Ukraine has those nukes, but they didn't abscond with them. They didn't steal them. So the fact that they give them up, it's not like they're not blackmailing.
Yeah,
them.
Like nobody's claiming they built their own nukes or something.
Right. But my point is, it's not their fault. It's like, for instance, I'll also make the argument it's not anyone's fault that Ukraine has the 20th largest oil supply in the world, and that's the reason why Russia is actually invading. I don't think they're doing it to protect the people of Donbass.
I don't like that. I think that's simplistic. I don't like, because it feels like this happens with every war. Every war is just resources now. In everyone's mind, it's always resources. It's always, for example, I see this about Niger right now. I see people saying that the whole world's going to invade and attack Niger because of its holding of 5% of the world's uranium supply. And that's too important for France for them to give up. Number one, they can get other suppliers, but there's other motivations as well. You can say resources plays a part, but people, I think, really want to be able to say this is the one true reason why Group A invaded, when it's usually a whole host of different reasons, and people want to oversimplify it for YouTube content and Twitter clips, and, you know, they want to package it for an audience, but it's never that simple. Resources, I think, one element of many that motivated the Russians to invade Ukraine. I do believe nationalism played a big part. I believe the base in Sevastopol played a big part as well. I believe there were a lot of different motivations that pushed the Russians to invade Ukraine. None of them, in my opinion, valid motivations, but I believe those motivations to exist more than Ukraine has oil, Russia invade for oil.
At all. I don't think so. I think their country is 35% of their GDP is petroleum. It's shrunk down to 18% of their GDP is petroleum. Over half of their government revenue comes from taxes on petroleum, and this is severely hurting them. So you have a country that's in between you and Germany, and that country is...
They've lost over 50% of government revenues. 50% of government revenues. Lost a ton of money on oil and gas sales. I think similar to like 50% as well. And now with their shipping in the Black Sea under threat from Ukrainian sea drones, oh, they're straining the system, man. They are straining the system.
Going to sell their own petroleum to fuck that. That's part of the reason why they invaded. And the other reason why I think they invaded when they did is the 200 F-35 Lightnings that are going to be shipped to NATO countries. You're going to have countries like Finland that has air supremacy over Russia now because Russia doesn't have anything in the arsenal that can stand up to an F-35.
I don't know if that's true. I mean, if someone was to say all of NATO has air superiority over Russia, I could believe that because that's a gigantic air fleet with a bunch of different countries. And after seeing Russia's air force's performance in this war and their inability to get air superiority over Ukraine, all of NATO's air forces work together. You know, it's hard for me to imagine that they would be able to stop air superiority from developing unless the world explodes because nuclear war. This should be avoided. I'm just talking about if we're talking about a conventional war. I have not heard anyone say that Finland alone with F-35s would be able to develop air superiority over Russia. Or what regions? Like, obviously, it couldn't be all of Russia. Is he saying that Finland could develop air superiority all the way to Moscow? He's obviously, it can't be all of Russia. That's just too gigantic. It's the largest country on earth. Can't be Russia, all of Russia. So I don't know what he's talking about. Is he just talking about the areas bordering Finland or does he really mean like all the way to Moscow? That's a very bold statement.
That's why I think Russia did
can carry nukes as well.
Yeah, well, so pretty much a B-52 can carry nukes. So this is kind of a misnomer. A B-1 can carry nukes. An F-117 can carry nukes. A B-2 can carry nukes. An F-16 can carry nukes. An F-15 can carry nukes. An F-18 can carry nukes. The whole
True. This is a really good point because I hear this all the time too.
The thing is, it's the A modification. Mm-hmm. They can all carry nukes. Nukes it just means it's a bomb that has a warhead with uranium, plutonium in it.
So just going back to make sure we hit the overarching thing. Destiny's stance is there was no real reason for Russia to invade. Do you agree with that or disagree with?
I don't like the framing of that question. What does it mean real reason? The question should be good reason. Like there's a reason why a burglar will break into somebody's home and steal all their jewelry, right? There's just not a good reason as to why they're doing it, because they shouldn't be doing it.
With that, he's saying whether it's moral, political.
Well, I mean,
whatever
there
it
are
may be.
reasons why.
Yeah, I mean, it wasn't justified.
Sure.
Excuse me.
The reason they want to keep Ukraine in their sphere of influence.
Yeah,
That's the reason.
Would you agree with that?
I agree they want Ukraine in their sphere of influence. I think their main reason, though, for
And you don't think they were justified?
look, the Donbass tried to secede, tried to be independent.
Oh, did he avoid that question? Answering if he thinks they're justified or not? That's interesting. Well, maybe he just didn't hear it. Again, he said he's very tired. I'm trying to be charitable.
And tried to join Russia. They got rejected.
Mhm.
Then they tried to be independent.
Yeah.
They recognized that independence. It was like a week or so after that. There ends up the war or the SMO started.
Sorry, let me
They
hear
got-
his description from the start to finish again. I want to hear his description how this goes.
Ukraine in their sphere of influence. I think their main reason, though, for
And you don't think they were justified?
look, the Donbass tried to secede, tried to be independent, tried to join Russia. They got rejected.
When I say the Donbass tried to succeed, there was a movement in the Donbass supplied by Russia and Russian agents that wanted to secede. When he says the Donbass wanted to succeed, he makes it sound like there was a popular sentiment amongst the majority of the people in the Donbass, which we don't know, and we have no polling data that would indicate that, that wanted to succeed. In fact, polls that were asked about this, none of them seemed to come back with the indication that the majority of the people of the Donbass wanted to be part of Russia.
Then they tried to be independent.
Yeah.
They recognized that independence. It was like a week or so after that. There ends up the war or the SMO starts. They call it Special Military Operation. Sends in about 90,000 guys. Not enough to take over the country.
Also, if somebody believes that there couldn't be a unpopular coup or something, or like an unpopular revolt where like a minority that doesn't share the majority's opinion tries to take over or succeeds in taking over, I mean, I could point to, for example, like the Rhodesians, where the majority of the civilian population did not like the idea of Ian Smith's white rule, but they were able to do that for about a decade. I think it was about a decade. I'd have to remember exactly how long the Rhodesian Bush War went on, but I don't. Sorry, I didn't do my Rhodesian Bush War study before today's stream.
Then they tried to be independent.
Yeah.
They recognized that independence. It was like a week or so after that. There ends up the war or the SMO starts. They call it Special Military Operation. Sends in about 90,000 guys. Not enough to take over the country and everything.
Yeah.
I think he was still trying to negotiate with the West by not going in full steam in the beginning. Maybe you can talk about the strategy part, but
I mean, we don't know if he was really trying to negotiate a settlement or if he was just getting his troops in position to engage in a further attack, because he had blood transfusions on the border of Ukraine. Now, you do not get your troops blood transfusions and get that stuff ready unless you're really intending to use force. So we don't really even know if he was open to any more offers at that point, or if he was just slowly moving his troops into position, getting ready for an opportunity to strike. But this all is going to be based on us knowing how secret meetings went, that we don't know how they went, and we won't know until maybe decades after the fact, if we ever know how those secret meetings went or what the intentions exactly were of all the actors at any specific time. So it's complete guesswork.
I'm anti-war. Like, I don't want there to be a war
For
between
sure.
Ukraine and Russia. But I feel like
How long until we get somebody on one of these podcasts when somebody says that, says, no, excuse me, I'm pro-war. You mean pro supporting? No, I'm just pro-war generally. I think war is good. It's a profitable industry. You know, it employs a lot of good people. I think it strengthens the human spirit. I think we all descend from Spartans and great warriors of the. I just once I want to see somebody come out and drop the Raytheon puppeteered opinion. Just one time.
the Ukraine side, Ukraine point of view is on TV. Like, if you want to hear what Ukraine thinks, just turn on the news.
Mhm.
Yeah,
you
but if we
don't-
wanted the war to be over, we should have just let Ukraine finish.
Give me a second. Sorry, there's like a gust of wind that kind of sounded like an engine for a moment, and I am not in my usual bunker studio, so I need to, if I ever hear an engine, I gotta stop. But I think it's just gust of wind. Let's continue.
But like the Ukraine side, Ukraine point of view is on TV. Like, if you want to hear what Ukraine thinks, just turn on the news.
Mhm.
Yeah, but if we wanted the war to be over, we should have just let Ukraine finish recapturing the Donbass. The war is only extended right now because of Russian troops, military training, and arms flowing into the country from the east.
Well, they're not going to let them retake or
Their own
conquer
country?
the Donbass because Russia then has to deal with NATO-trained standard troops on their border.
They already have to deal with NATO troops on their border in Finland. In fact, they have to deal with NATO on their border in Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, and Finland. Right? What the Russians should do, and this would be my recommendation, of course they're never going to listen to me, is try to get some deal out of this where Ukraine's no longer part of NATO. And I think that should be their, if you're looking from Putin's perspective, that should be their main priority, outside of like territorial holdings, which honestly would be most beneficial only really specifically to Putin, to like up his image, up his like, hey, look, this war wasn't all for nothing, right? Of course, I'm just speculating here about what he should or shouldn't do, and that of course assumes intentions. I think a lot of his intentions is political and staving off a political catastrophe, which would be a failure in this war for him. Anyway, let's continue. Sorry, we're 20 minutes in. I've said so much stuff. I really got to stop pausing and only pause when I really need to.
What about
border.
Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania?
Yeah,
They're already there.
Finland already has NATO trained troops.
Finland is there too, yeah.
Yeah, and the problem with, again, I'm going to say
all
this again.
Russia has done is expanded the amount of NATO countries on their borders now as a result of the conflict.
Ryan
in
gets to
Ukraine.
finish his point. You're saying you were saying that they'd have NATO trained troops.
Yeah, Estonia is not Ukraine. This is Ukraine's a much more powerful state, larger population, larger military presence, and they would love to not have that situation with Estonia and Finland either. But, Putin drew a line. He said, you're not going to expand in Ukraine.
And then they expanded into Finland and then doubled the NATO border. If the war, as he said, was launched to stop NATO expansion, it has been a massive failure. And Ukraine is now closer to NATO expansion than it ever has before, with NATO states more warmed up to the fact than ever.
And they have a lot of, like you guys were saying, there's a lot of resources there that are in play. And they didn't have the Nord Stream lines yet, and those got blown up.
Mm-hmm.
But they
Also, I think this should be a basic point, but nation states determine what they can do with their own resources. It's not Russia's decision, and it's not America's decision what they do with their own resources. That only really happens if Ukraine decides they're going to lease stuff to other countries, right? Or sign certain contracts that way. As far as I'm aware, they haven't signed any contracts with the Russians that say they get the rights to these resources. How it's supposed to work is that nation states determine who they get to trade with after they're given the best offer for the resources. Companies usually within those states do that, and then they trade. It's supposed to work where you invade, conquer territory, and then you get their oil. So my position on Ukrainian resources and who should get it is determined upon who the Ukrainians want to trade it with. I don't think that should be decided by force. Resource wars are dangerous things.
They had to transit through Ukraine. They were going to circumvent them and go directly to Germany.
Sure.
But they also knew how easily you can reverse that by blowing up the line.
Well, but there's also the problem.
Console, thank you so much for the raid of 14. I appreciate it, buddy. Thank you.
Is that
Which they said they did.
And I was expecting a lot more from this debate. We're halfway through. I feel like I can say this now. I was expecting more from Ryan. But hey, we're halfway through. He said he was tired. Maybe he'll get more energetic later half.
Themselves at first.
so?
Wait, who said they did it?
He's saying Ukraine said they did. Ukraine
Did not
militias.
take credit for those
No,
attacks.
Ukraine didn't say that. Just Western media tried to act like Russia blew up its own pipeline.
Oh, got it. So Russia didn't actually say they blew
No,
up
the
their own
official
pipeline.
story now is Ukraine blew up the pipeline.
There is no official
Yeah, I don't
story.
think there's an official story. There's one official story that Sweden or Norway had something to do with blowing it up.
We don't have an official story of who did it. Some reports are saying it's a Ukrainian aligned group. Others are saying it could have been the Ukrainian government, but Zelensky wouldn't have known about it. There are still others that say that it was the Russians. Of course, there's Seymour Hersh's assessment that it was the American government, but there's some problems with his theory. We don't know for sure. And I mean, you can like read into motives and try to like play logic man, but I'm not going to play any guesswork.
Yeah, Cy Hirsch had his well, it supposedly documented, it was in a Substack article. He thought that it was the U.S. blew up the line.
Yep. And now the story is actually, this is the weird thing, because wouldn't it, if the story comes out that it was actually the Ukrainians, what does that mean for all of those people who pushed the Seymour Hersh article? Because there's a lot of people who pushed the Seymour Hersh article, and I have a weird feeling they're all just going to pretend they never pushed it, and they're going to switch sides and be like, actually, yeah, no, it was the Ukrainians all along. I knew it. Do you think we'll ever know the truth? Possibly when the war's over. A lot of this stuff comes up decades after the fact, when like declassified CIA reports, freedom of information requests. But again, that would be in America. I have no clue how that type of process of trying to get those documents out to the public would work in Ukraine. Definitely, if they did do it, this would be like a top tippy top secret thing that the Ukrainians obviously wouldn't want to get out, because that could damage their relationship with certain European states.
Using allies.
Yeah, but Hersh's story is total conjecture. He provides no compelling evidence, no proof in that
And
entire.
the U.S.'s story is, no, he didn't do it. Ukraine did it.
The U.S. does not say Ukraine did it. I think right now the position is, if you look at all the evidence, it looks like it was probably Ukraine. I think that's a fair assumption to make. I think the most credible story I've seen so far is that the Ukrainian military, without Zelensky's knowledge, might have sent forces to that area and destroyed those pipelines. But I've also heard, I believe that Norway said they've witnessed like Russian ships, like 3 Russian ships that were in areas they weren't supposed to be, that could have been equipped for diving operations. So it looks like Ukraine might have done it, but there is no official story. I don't think anybody knows right now
So
for
do you
sure.
have anything back for that, Ryan? Or
I don't know.
Dylan, can't you just ask your dad who did it? It's my grandpa. People forget it's my grandfather who's the director of the CIA, not my father. Thank you.
What about the Russian ship?
People who are unaware are going to go Google it. CIA director. Oh my God, it is.
So
It's a good rumor. Not rumor.
it's not, there's no reason for Russia to blow up its own pipeline when they can just turn off the gas and
Sure.
leave the infrastructure.
Just so we're clear, there was no gas actually running through the pipeline at that point. There was gas in the pipeline because you can't keep it in a vacuum. But
Yeah, they had 2 lines, but it was, on the verge of opening.
So let's just to go back to what I was saying before. One of the reasons why the Middle East became so wealthy the way that it did is because it's easier to dig for oil in.
It was Just Stop Oil that bombed the pipeline. That's the secret ending. That's the secret ending. You gotta unlock all the achievements. You gotta 100% speed run it. That's the secret ending. We gotta unlock that.
And countries.
Just Stop Oil.
So that's also the reason why we dig for oil in West Texas and places like that. That's why you don't dig for oil in places like Colorado. It's harder to get through that type of environment because of new technologies as far as extracting oil. There's all of a sudden all this oil that's in Ukraine that's available now that wasn't really available 30 years ago. That's a part of this that's kind of being missed. And a lot of it's around Crimea. So what's happened is Ukraine was threatening also to allow.
Can I also say about Crimea, and this is something I actually learned more recently, because I decided that I'd be the most boring person in the world, and I'd go through the old Soviet documents on the handover of Crimea from Russia to Ukraine, from the Soviet Union when they decided to hand it over to Ukraine, and the reason they gave in the official document is that Crimea was economically essential. That Crimea was economically essential to Ukraine, which is something that I actually hear a lot, which is not talked about often with my Ukrainian friends, is how much them not having areas like Kherson, Zaporozhye, Donetsk, Luhansk, and Crimea is going to cripple the Ukrainian economy, cripple their maritime industries, shipping, and also resource extraction. Not to mention, of course, tourism, because Crimea is a massive tourism hotspot.
Allow Western countries to come in and get some of that oil.
Oh, and of course, Russia can always use Crimea as a launching pad to harass Ukrainian shipping, as they're doing right now.
Oil. It's not just the fact that Russia can't go through Ukraine with their pipelines to sell their oil. It's that Ukraine will then sell its own oil. Does that make sense? You have a country, a petrostate, which is basically what Russia is. 33% or 35 to 30% of their GDP came from petroleum. And now you have a neighbor that's in between you and your number one buyer of oil, which is Germany. And he's saying, hey, not only are we going to make it harder for you to sell your oil through our country, we're going to sell our own oil. That, to me, was a pretense for them to invade. To me, that was the number one pretense for them to invade. Not because they're worried about ethnic Russians in the eastern part. No offense to
They have a
Vladimir
naval
Putin.
base in Crimea. They can't lose either.
They already
No,
had
yeah.
that was already an autonomous region. They already had agreements to have Sevastopol, that naval base there. There were no problems with that. Most of the people in Crimea, one of the reasons why
This is true. You can't really talk about the Sevastopol base when you talk about 2022 invasion. They already had control of Crimea. Illegal control, but they had control.
the invasion probably worked, because most people there were friendly towards the Russian Navy. They had no problem with the ships there. They were in and out all the time. That port was used pretty.
In a weird way, somebody just said in gutter chat too, they're both right. I do think that the resources came into play, and I do think the base of Sevastopol came into play in 2014. I think it less came into play with the 2022 invasion, though.
Commonly, but it's not like that port was ever under threat.
Okay, agreement with that, or
Yeah, I was saying that's just another reason. In addition, I don't know to what degree Ukrainian oil going on in the market is worth a war. It's going to cost a lot more.
But the problem is, it's a bunch of things, right? Is it worth a war if that's all you sell? Do you see what I'm saying? Is it worth a war if they take away Germany, which is buying?
What is that saying? Russia is what is it? It's a giant gas station with a nuclear arsenal. That's the old insult towards Russia. Is that where we're leaning into now?
30% of its petroleum from Russia. And is it worth a war if you know they can just bomb the Nord Stream pipeline? Do you see what I'm saying? It's like now your security, your ability to sell petroleum is now put direly at risk. And while the United States, we use a lot of petroleum, our economy is not 30 or even 20% based on
Aren't
just
they going to sanction them from selling oil to all those places for going to war anyway?
But here's the problem. That is exactly my next point, which is even if they win, because my point was about the strategy, even if they win, they lose. That was my issue with this whole thing. Because in the end, you had President Putin, he goes off and he lies to the entire.
Somebody in chat just brought up a good point. Kiev stuff. The swole guys are too fixated on the oil. We find he's Dick Cheney's little minion. He's being paid by Cheney. He's being paid off by BP. He's actually on the BP board. We don't know it.
World and says he's not going to invade, and then he invades. And while again, great statecraft, incredible military strategy, absolutely terrible when it comes to diplomacy, you're gonna have to pay for that in the end. When you tell the world that you have hypersonic missiles, and then you have the Ukrainians shoot down those hypersonic missiles, turns out they're not hypersonic missiles at all. When you tell the world that you have Sukhoi 57s that are,
well, they could still be hypersonic missiles, I assume, right? It could just be really good air defense systems. Patriots are good.
are supposedly better than F-22s and F-35s, and it turns out you don't even use them in battle. When you tell the world that you have these incredible S-14 tanks that are supposed to be able to knock out anything, and they're just getting blown up on the side of the road. Russia has lost 1,500 tanks in this war.
That's not true. Visually confirmed, I think it's 2,200. 2,200. He's using an old number, but that's just visually confirmed, meaning the number probably a little bit higher. So that's just like tanks we've seen blown up. That have been independently verified by OPSEC people like Oryx, who accumulates all this data, all these photographs, tallies them all up. The last milestone I heard was 2,200. Hey, 100 biddies from Gutter Chat. They aren't hypersonic beyond the way all missiles are hypersonic like the first missile ever. This is getting too weapons technical, which I am not an expert on.
Already, that's incredible. Just for size and ratio, the United States lost 80 M1 Abrams tanks during all of their invasion of Iraq the entire time, and 63 of them they put back in service. What's happened with Russia is, I don't want to get too far into this, but there's this huge design defect with the tanks where they put the shells right next to the turret, and when you hit it with a javelin, then all of a sudden it blows up the.
I forget what they call this. I think they call it the Jack in the Box effect. I don't know if you guys have ever seen it. Let me bring this up. I'm gonna hope that was a car door slamming. We're just gonna keep going. But I don't know if you guys ever seen the Jack in the Box effect with the Russian tanks. Jack in the Box. Basically, they store the ammo under the turret where they keep the crew. And so if the tank is hit, this happens. There's the turret. You can see, oh, let me turn off the music. You can see the turret flying in the air there. Called the Jack in the Box effect. Because it pops up like the clown in the Jack in the Box. And there you can see it. It flies out. I've even seen a few where the crew members, you can actually see the crew members flying in the sky. Yep, there's another one. Yeah, no. Not the best design. Not the best design. But autoloaders are cool, I guess.
the entire tank, and you can see photographs all over the place. Look it up yourself, with tanks with the turrets like knocked off. And this is another problem. So now Russia, their second biggest export, which is military defense, nobody wants to buy their Sukhoi 27s because they don't work. Nobody wants to buy their tanks because they don't work. They don't want to buy the T-52s, the T-72s, the T-90s, the T-80s.
Oh yeah, I think like the Russian arms export industry went down like, I forget the exact numbers. It used to be like, I think it was like 50 billion. I was down to 10 billion. It was like a 60, 70, 80% drop, which isn't surprising, not only because, you know, less people want to buy it because it's not performing the best, but also, you know, they're using up a lot of their production domestically.
Nobody wants to buy these tanks. So Russia has triple fucked themselves. They're going to have sanctions with them as far as they're selling petroleum. They're going to have sanctions with them as far as their trade agreements. They're going to have a bunch of companies that are like, we don't want your armament anymore. It clearly put into use against American armament. You guys could not stand up to them. And then finally,
Do you think tanks have done well on either side?
I think tanks are going to do really well when those 31 M1 Abrams show up in Ukraine in a couple months. I think tanks are going to do really well. A T-72 can.
It depends on what, like, when people say the tanks are going to do well, let's be clear. The Abrams tank is a great tank. Okay, it did well in the Gulf War. It did well in Iraq. It is a fantastic tank, good tank. But the tank is only as good as how you use it and the environment you use it in. If a tank gets stuck in the mud and it can't move around, like, it'll be a sitting duck for Russian artillery. It'll be a sitting duck for Russian shoulder-mounted munitions, you know, RPGs, stuff like that. It'll be a sitting duck for type of drone drop munition. If they're using some kind of like bonsai charge to try to break through the front line, and they happen upon entrenched Russian positions that have not been thoroughly prepared, as in like riddled with artillery shells to make it so they're not like properly softened up, then they could get lost, and you could have a situation like we saw with the Russians in Volodar, where you lose a lot of armored columns. And that happened in the second weeks of the counteroffensive, which is going to happen. Vehicles are going to explode. They're going to be damaged in war. Those images were inevitable. But it all depends on how you use them. The weapon is only good as its user. If the weapon is used incorrectly, then it won't be that effective. So Abrams tanks, good tanks. Hope the Ukrainians can find a way to use them effectively.
A T-72 cannot do anything to an M1 Abrams. It cannot. And that's going to be a serious problem for Russia.
I don't think it's a tank on tank issue, though. It's tank
a javelin on tank.
Landmines and helicopters and things.
A lot of tanks are used in more of an artillery role now. It's artillery, counter battery fire, landmines, tank ditches, entrenched positions. When we're talking about Zaporozhye, especially, the like kind of like armored like tank breakthroughs aren't like, there haven't really been much tank on tank battles. But certain tanks are sturdier than other tanks and have like their turrets can be used more. They maybe have faster reload speed. You know, you get the idea. I would have to go back for all the specific like comparisons for the tanks. I don't want to do specific comparisons to the tanks right now. But yeah, there's not much tank on tank combat in the war in Ukraine. A lot of tanks are being used in a way that's really not effective. It's going to run out the turret very quickly in kind of like a supportive artillery capacity. And to, of course, support like infantry advances.
Yeah, but
I don't think the Leopard 248 is a bad tank. I just think any tank that walked into a field of landmines that's getting targeted by drones and Hornet missiles and helicopters and anti-tank personnel is going to get destroyed. We're not
as long as you don't properly soften up the position, and you don't have a million of these tanks who just continuously zerg rush until a breakthrough happens. Ryan is right. But the question is, how well are the Russians faring in their defense right now? From my read of Russian Telegram, it's not as good as the Russian government would make it out to be. They're not in like Kharkiv breakthrough moments right now, but it does sound like a lot of the early stages or mid to early stages in the Kherson counteroffensive, where they're, you know, running out of supplies, their logistics are strained, they're taking a lot of casualties. The Ukrainian battery fire is getting extremely intensive. The Ukrainians have to rely less now due to a lack of Russian counter battery fire. They have to rely less on scoot and shoot tactics, where they move to a spot, fire, then move to another spot. So they can do a lot more continuous artillery fire, which gets a lot more shells downrange, really helping the Ukrainians. And not to mention, the Ukrainians have more troops to commit now. and these, so they're bringing back the troops that were initially engaged in the Zaporozhye counteroffensive. They've committed new Western trained, refreshed troops to continue this grinding advance, slow advance, but they are making more progress. The question is whether they're going to make enough progress, enough notable progress before winter sets in and then winter fighting occurs, and if the Ukrainians are prepared to continue any offensive into the winter, which is a big question mark, a big question around that.
Having giant tank versus tank battles is not World War II.
We had one. We did have one in, I forgot what the city was, but there was a
also, no matter how many entrenchments you build, if you can't supply your soldiers, you can't fight a war. So if the Kerch Bridge goes under, and we see the Ukrainians targeting the Kerch Bridge, the more they strain Russian logistics, the harder it's going to be for the defenders. And that's what the Storm Shadows and other long-range missiles and possible ATACMS shipments can help the Ukrainians do.
Massive one in the
apparently drone boats as well.
The entire Russian tank brigade was lost.
Volgograd, but they lost the tanks to Ukrainian landmines and things. It's not.
But my point is this: like, one of the issues that Ukraine, and by the way, it was Prigozhin, how you say his name? He was
Prigozhin.
Was the one who actually said this. But this is before the coup, the attempted coup, whatever it was.
Some people think I think mutiny is a better word, but it doesn't matter like that much.
He actually was talking about how the Ukrainian military, which by the way has been trained in large part by the United States. I wouldn't even possibly deny that. And by the way,
I would deny that. The majority of Ukrainian soldiers have not been trained by NATO trainers or Western trainers. Most Ukrainian soldiers have learned from firsthand battle experience or have been trained by like domestic soldiers. More and more being trained on NATO standards, and we started to see some of that in between 2014 and 2022, but still the majority of Ukrainian military reforms happened within Ukraine. And I think sometimes the brilliance of Western advisors and Western trainers is sometimes overemphasized. It's helpful. There's a reason why Ukraine still wants it. I mean, obviously, the United States has shown itself to be an effective fighting force. Same with the United Kingdom and many of the other nations that are training Ukrainian soldiers. But I think sometimes it is undersold the domestic transformation of the Ukrainian armed forces in comparison to 2014, when the Ukrainian military could muster, like 10,000 effective troops?
Ukrainian fighter pilots right now, while we're speaking, are training at Shepherd Air Force Base in Wichita Falls, Texas, to fly those jets, those F-16 squadrons that they're about to get. My point with that is that, like, he actually said Ukrainians use doctrine of mechanized infantry along with tanks, along with aircraft. They're using them together. The Russians don't do that. The Russians will just run a bunch of tanks into a certain place, or they'll just use artillery, or they'll just use air power, and they don't have the ability to coordinate. That was Prigozhin who said this.
He's talking about combined arms warfare. Oh, isn't that a fun buzzword?
And so my point is, this whole thing is like, even though you have a country that is 4 times bigger than the other country, this should be a first round.
By the way, it's not that the Russians don't know how to do that. They're supposed to know how to do that. It's just that a lot of people on the ground don't know how to communicate that. There's really bad communication between Russian units because Wagner hates Shoigu's PMC. Wagner hates a lot of the Russian military. And a lot of these times, there's these units that are holding each other's flanks, or these groups that are holding each other's flanks that hate each other. And Russian volunteers will come back from the front after they delivered like new boots or whatever to soldiers, and they'll say something along the lines of like, they aren't communicating. They all hate each other. They're all saying that the other sides aren't fighting enough. They haven't sacrificed enough. And that if there's ever any victory, they always claim it for themselves. There's not a lot of, I guess you could say, cohesion. There's a lot of division within the military, which bubbled up in the Wagner coup. And so if you're not having really good communication on the ground, your logistics is getting strained. And a lot of the commanders are in power, not because they're the most brilliant, but especially after the Wagner coup, as we saw Surovikin go under, who was actually a semi-competent military commander who really grounded his teeth in Syria, butchering civilians in a bombing campaign. That's also going to compromise your ability to conduct competent combined arms warfare, right? But in theory, the Russians should be able to do it.
Knockout. This should have ended in the first week. The fact that we're at a year and 5 months, I think this is a really, really bad experience for Russia. And I don't see any way for them out of this without.
So you think Ukraine is winning the conflict?
It's like this. If I'm the underdog and we're tied, I'm winning the conflict. Do you understand what I'm saying?
But you think it's tied?
Well, no, but the thing is, right now, well, just so you know, when you have an invading force going up against a defending force throughout history, the invading force loses more people. They just do, because it's just harder. Their supply lines are further. Also, if you have an invading force, let's just say for every person that's fighting, you need 3 behind them in support. So that we're talking about medical, we're talking about logistics, we're talking about fuel, we're talking about food.
I'm sorry, I hate answering the question, is Ukraine winning? Because it depends on how you define winning. If you define winning by how the Russians initially defined what they were going into Ukraine to do, then yes, Ukraine is winning. The Russians said they went into Ukraine because they were going to demilitarize Ukraine. Well, they failed there. Ukraine's more militarized than ever. They went into Ukraine to stop the expansion of NATO. Well, Finland joined NATO, doubling their border with NATO, the Russians' border with NATO, and Sweden is on the way, and Ukraine's closer to joining NATO than it's ever been. So I think so far that has been a failure. Even if they stop Ukraine from joining NATO, NATO still expanded during the war, in direct response to the war. That's a failure. Denazification, I think, is mostly a buzzword for propaganda, but I think many can interpret that as also regime change. If you're getting out the Nazis in government, you would have to, depose the Ukrainian government. He failed in doing that, despite reportedly multiple assassination attempts on Zelensky's life. Zelensky's still alive. His government has stayed united, and many people thought he was going to flee, but he didn't, and that was very important for the cohesiveness of the Ukrainian state early on. That has failed. One of the things he wanted to do was, he claimed at the start, protect the civilians of eastern Ukraine. Well, and this is something we didn't talk about earlier when we talked about the 14,000 number, but I think this is relevant to that too. If you look at 2021 and how many civilians died in eastern Ukraine from like shelling, the number I think is 7. 7. As in like 7 people, not 7,000, not 7 million, 7. Now, that's sad. That's a tragedy. The civilians that died on both sides of the firing line. But 7 is very different to the gigantic amount of civilians that died in eastern Ukraine in 2022 and 2023. Primarily Russian-speaking population, the same population that they said they were going into Ukraine to liberate. I was in Kharkiv. I saw the targeting of the electrical infrastructure. I interviewed people who had lost their family members, many of whom spoke Russian, to the Russian bombardment. After they failed to take the city, they started shelling Kharkiv relentlessly with cluster munitions and very dense civilian areas. So not only do I believe that the protection of the Russian speakers is nonsense, because they didn't act like they were protecting Russian speakers there. Once their liberation was rejected, they started bombing them indiscriminately. But that has failed, because the amount of Russian speakers that are dying in eastern Ukraine has skyrocketed by like 10,000 to 20,000% in comparison to what the casualties were before the Russians invaded in 2022. So I think that's been a massive failure. And the last one is, the liberation of like Donbass. This is something that's been restated later. Well, we're going to take Donbass, we're going to take Luhansk and Donetsk, we're going to take it over. Well, it's been 1.5 years, almost 2 years now, and they still have yet to take Kramatorsk, Slovansk, and a bunch of other locations. The Russians have yet to take a single oblast in its entirety since their invasion of the country in 2022. Outside, of course, Crimea, which they took in 2014. So they have failed on that front so far. But that's if we go by the initial wants of the Russian government. If we talk about now, and we're talking about what Ukraine wants, which is the liberation of all of its territory, what Russia wants, which is conquering Donetsk and Luhansk and holding on to whatever they can, right? Possibly future counteroffensives to go back into Kharkiv, who knows? But as far as we know right now, the most concrete things we know that they want is the rest of the Donbass, Donetsk, Luhansk, Kramatorsk, those locations. Then we don't know yet. We don't know who's winning in the way that the Russians haven't taken it, so they haven't won. The Ukrainians have a long ways to go before they take Crimea, if we paint that as Ukrainian victory. So based on that, the determined what the outcome is still in the air. And anybody who told you it's already over and the Ukrainians have already won when it comes to that is lying. When it comes to what Russians originally wanted, they're not going to overthrow the Ukrainian government and install a puppet. That's not happening. But when it comes to this new arena, these new goalpost move demands or desires of the Russian government, that's still in the air. And I'm going to be the last person to tell you that victory is certain. While the willpower of the Ukrainian people is extremely powerful, reality can also be extremely powerful. And sometimes what is the best moral outcome does not just fall from the sky, you know? Reality can be very cruel. And so I'm going to be the last person to tell you that the justice shall always prevail. So whether the Ukrainians will win or lose, I think is largely determined upon the skill of Ukrainian commanders on the ground, how they use the supply the West gave them, and very importantly, the West continuing to give them the supplies necessary to keep up with the fight, and them upping arms production on things like artillery shells to keep the Ukrainians well supplied, and there being a unified, cohesive force internationally. And whether that's going to happen is still up in the air. So when somebody says who's winning, I mean, everybody's going to have a different frame of reference for what they call winning, right?
For the invading force, you need about 7 or 8.
Okay.
That's a really reductive way to look at it.
Okay.
But you need more than twice as many people to invade as you do to defend. Does that make sense?
Yeah,
right?
of course.
So the problem is with the attrition situation, you have one country that has it. You notice how Ukraine is not trying to defend the whole country. They're trying to defend Kiev more than any other part.
Yeah.
And so when that happens, you have an unlimited budget. We can all agree to that, right? Ukraine has more money to spend than Russia.
Yeah.
Or do you guys disagree with that?
They have the pockets of all
They
of
have
Europe and the
US as
US.
well.
Yeah, correct. So just for people to understand, Ukraine or NATO has.
I don't know if I really want to debate this. It depends on like what type of money. Like if we're talking about like financial assistance and stuff like that, I don't even know if that's true. I would have to check the numbers. I would have to combine all the aid and look at it, but I don't necessarily know if that's true or not. But they have access to more capital overall than the Russians do, certainly.
Has a $1 trillion defense budget. That's including the $800 trillion that they get from the United States. And Russia has an $80 billion defense budget. I'm sorry, 1 trillion versus 80 billion.
Yeah.
So it's about 12 or 13 times as much.
But we're not just giving them our entire defense budget. So whatever.
Ukraine has a blank check. The United States is giving them javelins.
I wish they had a blank check. They don't have a blank check. If they had a blank check, we would have given them the ATACMS. If they had a blank check, we would have given them the F-16s already. And we wouldn't have dilly-dallied. The Ukrainians, as much as people like to pretend they have a blank check, they don't have a blank check. If they had a blank check, they would have gotten the cluster munitions much earlier. They don't have a blank check.
If you think this is wrong, if you think this is morally wrong, I'm not here to have that argument. My point is, if the United States
Maybe he means assets, possibly. Who knows?
is giving them top-tier anti-tank weapons, 2 squadrons of F-16s, and their first
Sounds like he's talking about military weapons, but I'll take your word for it.
battalion of M1 Abrams tanks that Russia has no chance against. God forbid if they bring F-35s into this. I just don't see how Russia can win. That's my point.
I disagree with that, all of it. I don't. I'm not big on the US's wonder weapons. They thought that would be the HIMARS. They thought it would be the Javelins. They thought it would be the Leopards, and they're all.
The HIMARS were very destructive on the battlefield. They destroyed a lot of Russian ammunition depots, killed a lot of Russian soldiers. And it was very useful for the Ukrainian counteroffensives in Kherson and on other locations. And I don't know if I'd call it a super weapon. I think, that would be obviously an exaggeration, but it was very effective. The Javelin, very useful for, ambush operations, attacking, armored vehicles, very helpful. Definitely, since it comes over on the top, it doesn't hit the front of it. It'll specifically guide itself above the tank, above the armor vehicle, and attack it from above where it has less armor. Again, not a wonder weapon, but a good weapon.
All just getting destroyed. I think
They're all just getting destroyed. As far as I know, okay, I'm going to ask this. I haven't checked in a while. How many HIMARS have been destroyed by the Russian government? Does anybody know? Because the last time I checked, none have. Maybe since then, one has been destroyed. That has been revealed. But all the evidence I've seen, like I remember Coach Red Pill, also known as Gonzalo Lira, he came forward and made a bunch of claims. And like the video that like being talked about were like video games, like Arma footage that have been repurposed. It was like there's, as far as I know, not a single HIMARS has been destroyed. Maybe one or maybe two has since I've last checked. But last time I checked, it was 0. So I don't know what he means by they're getting destroyed. And even if 1 or 2 got destroyed, that's a lot less than, oh, they're all getting destroyed. It makes it sound like these weapons are getting annihilated and blown out the water, which is not the case. So I'm not familiar with what he means by this, that the HIMARS are all getting destroyed. I know the Russian government has claimed to destroy a lot of HIMARS. The Russian government has also claimed to shoot down more Ukrainian aircraft than the Ukrainians even have. Destroyed its air force 2 or 3 times over, which obviously is ridiculous. It means they're making fanciful claims to cover up for their failures. And that was the same thing with the HIMARS, which became something that a lot of Russian soldiers were genuinely afraid of because of its deep range.
I think the war of attrition, like I do agree, they're not going to run out of money because they have NATO money.
Yeah.
So they're not going to run out of money. It's going to be hard to make them run out of toys. They might run out of ammo temporarily, but they're not going to run out of stuff because NATO will keep giving them things.
Agreed.
They will run out of personnel.
I mean, it depends on how long the war goes. But there's still a lot. I mean, I hate to be blunt about it. There's still a lot of people that could be drafted, but I mean, years down the line, that might become more of an issue. Especially when we talk about like experienced personnel, which a lot of them have been killed throughout the war. But also, I don't know if it's really as much of a blank check on weapons and stuff. If Western resolve breaks, weapon shipments will go down.
Possibly, but I think they have better trained
The attrition
personnel.
war, I think they were trying to set up a porcupine. And they thought that the sanctions were going to be, even Russia thought this too, that the sanctions were going to be way more devastating than they were.
They were pretty, I mean, 50% drop in government revenues, 50% drop in oil and gas revenues. I think that's pretty significant. Taking on the first deficit in a very long time. A lot of its foreign reserves frozen. I think half of them frozen. And the ones that they do have, they're burning up quick. I mean, a lot of employees have fled the country. A lot of people who are working for these Western companies which pulled out. You're seeing Russia doing whatever they can to scramble for whatever kind of chip components they can get to fill their longer range, more accurate weapons, which they can't directly get from the West anymore. Maybe they have to get through third parties or find other ways to kind of squiggle around it, but that the strain is there. The ruble, which has been artificially kept afloat for some time, is finally starting to feel the damage. I don't think that there was much expectation that the Russian government would necessarily collapse under the sanctions. The point of the sanctions is to make it as difficult as possible for the Russians to fund the war effort. And it has made it more difficult for the Russians to fund the war effort, as they've done like a 200 to 300% increase in military spending, while they're also having less revenue that they've had in a very long time, the least revenue that they've had in a while.
They were pretty much ineffectual. And they thought if we can bleed them with sanctions and force them to charge into well-fortified, bunkered, entrenched positions, it would be, pure victory.
I mean, you could just look at like the consumer spending of Russian consumers also, like the drastic drop off in the people who were buying cars, the whittling down of their savings value, the fact that the only way that they could even keep the ruble afloat for as long as they did is the fact that they basically made it impossible for you to trade the ruble for anything else. I mean, the deals that they made with Western companies who were pulling out, where they were making them sell, if they wanted to sell and pull out, they had to give a certain portion of their money to the Russian government and sell it at a steep discount, ruining the relationship with a lot of these companies, meaning that these companies might not come back for decades because there's going to be like a big warning sign over investing in Russia for a very long time, as long as this administration's in power, and possibly even if this administration goes away or this type of administration goes away. It's going to be difficult to convince those investors in the future. Look, I don't even think we've seen all the long-term effects on the Russian economy that are going to develop and show itself in the years to come. But I mean, I don't want to stand here and just be quiet as if the image that's being painted is that the Russian government has fared quite well with the sanctions, because the Russian economy is in a sorry state. They're not on the brink of collapse or anything, right? But the Russian government is not in a very strong economic state.
Victories at best. And Ukraine has been extremely tough, extremely resilient. And in the beginning of the war, they did have very, crack defense. And they kind of pussyfooted their way in with 90,000 troops. But Russia was looking at it, holding back, because they also didn't know whether or not they could deal with the sanctions. Without the clock on their side, because they're not in a hurry, they're not bleeding from sanctions. They decided to go with the meat grinder approach instead of the blitzkrieg approach. They're going to sit back with artillery. the very slow, methodical way.
That is what Russians are good at.
Where you can destroy them at range. You don't lose a lot of personnel because you're hitting them from further away than they can hit you. It's a very slow way to do it, but they've got all the time because the sanctions are hurting NATO more than they're hurting Russia.
Well, I mean, that's just fucking dumb. I mean, I don't know if I would say, I mean, he said things that are not true, or before maybe I would say maybe a little deceptive on this show, but like, that was just dumb. NATO would not be enforcing the sanctions if they were doing more damage to NATO than they were doing to Russia. The economic damage done to Russia by the sanctions is much greater than the damage done to the vast majority, or possibly I think all European states that have enforced sanctions, and also of course the United States. That's not even really disputable. There's not a 50% drop in government revenues in Germany. There's not a 50% drop in government revenues in the United States. Our GDP in the United States is at growth at 2.5%, producing like tens of thousands of jobs every month. That is not the state of the Russian economy. To say that America or the Western alliance, if that's what you want to call it, is faring worse than the Russian economy right now, that's just a crack of shit. That's the only way I could describe it. It's not good. There's not millions of people leaving Germany to flee conscription. And their jobs leaving the country. There's not a state where the German government has to take up its hardworking 20 to 35 to 40-year-old population and throw them into a meat grinder because your people, even though it's kind of, maybe a little demented to look at it this way, but it's the truth. Your people are also an economic resource. Grinding up a generation of Russians in a meat grinder approach is not going to spell good things for the long-term demographic and economic cohesion of the Russian state. Anyway, I'll let everybody else respond to this.
And Ukraine is running out of personnel.
Because I disagree.
The sanctions are hurting NATO more?
Yeah, because the reason why I disagree is because we've already had China denounce what's going on in Ukraine. So that to me, China is going to be.
What does that have to do? That's not a good response to what he said at all. Just bring up the numbers. Just bring up the numbers. And you don't, if like, I know people are like, well, but the Russian government numbers align. You can look at other economic indicators. You can look at like electricity consumption and other things like that to find out how the Russian government is faring. You can actually, even though the Russian government might lie about exports, you could look at the nations that they trade with and check their export data, which I know a good study at Yale did about a year ago when they were checking on the economic effects on the Russian Federation earlier on in the war. Like, I assume that neither Destiny or him know much about the Yale study or this either. I bet they didn't really think they were going to talk too much about the economic stuff, but yeah, no, the idea that Europe is faring worse than Russia economically, in response to the sanctions, that's just a crack of shit.
Yeah, and I think Russia's done some funny things, I think, with their currency and everything, with disallowing people to sell Russian currency. And they're doing ways to try to artificially inflate like the economy they have. But I'm pretty sure most experts agree there's been like a pretty big contraction of the Russian economy.
It's been 3% a quarter for Russia's GDP over the last couple of years.
It's already a country that's got pretty poor, I think, in terms of GDP per capita. Like, Russia is not the richest country in the world.
Russia is about as wealthy as Mexico, and a lot of people don't realize that. Russia is right on point. Russia has a smaller GDP than Italy.
In California too.
I don't think you can judge the real economy just by GDP numbers.
But what I think is you can judge how well you can replace tanks and replace aircraft and replace anti-tank.
Well, wait, okay. No, that's not necessarily true. I mean, like, Russia can produce much more tanks than Mexico or Italy. They just absolutely they could. Now, if you were to take the Western Alliance and put them into full-blown war mode or production modes or rate of production that was even relatively of the same kind of like vibe of the Russia, I don't know how to put this, but of the same kind of like, if they felt like fire under their feet, the West, to produce weapons, like they could produce an amount of weapons after a few years that would be well more than enough to supply the Ukrainians. That's why it's a question of will. The question of will. But I don't think the GDP of a country necessarily is going to tell you how much weapons they can produce in the immediate future. Because a country could have a gigantic GDP invested into commercial assets, and then a war happens and they got a gigantic GDP. but they don't have a ton of stuff in like military factories, and it takes time to convert factories. So it's not as simple as like, well, they have high GDP, or this is their GDP, so that shows how many weapons they could produce. A country could basically just be like a gigantic arms factory, have a relatively low GDP, and be able to produce a ton amount of weapons while being economically weaker. Now, down the road, if more economically powerful states start to convert their factories, and with time, like the engines like starts rearing in these countries, then yeah, that's going to be a problem for that state in the long term. Japan, I think, versus the United States in World War II is an example of this. Like the engine, once American production really picked up, the Japanese just couldn't compete.
Weapons with economy, and then once your biggest secondary supplier,
they're out of 155 millimeter ammo. Even like NATO's supply, that's why they went to cluster ammunitions. They don't have enough artillery shells to shoot, and Russia's able to do that around the clock, and they're not running.
Not that simple. The Russians are also having problem with counter or battery fire in Zaporozhye. Some of it I assume is due to like shell shortages or shell problems. Prigozhin constantly complained about shell problems. Russian soldiers on the ground complained about shell problems, but a lot of it I don't even know if it's they don't have shells. They do get shells, even if they have tremendously high dead rates. They do have shells, but you have to get the shell to the unit, and that logistical problem is something that the Russians have fumbled quite a lot. And with the recent Ukrainian strikes on the Kerch Bridge and the recent Ukrainian strikes on the bridge that connects Crimea to Kherson, that were meant to undercut Russian logistics, the idea that the Russians could just constantly pump out artillery is far from a given. As Zaporozhye and the complaint from as Zaporozhye shown from Russian military bloggers constantly complaining about a lack of Russian counter battery fire, which has allowed the Ukrainians to embed their artillery there and not even engage in a ton of shoot and scoot tactics, just constantly firing at the Russian positions, the entrenched positions in Zaporozhye that they're trying to take.
Running out of supplies. They've been preparing for this for a while.
I'm pretty sure, haven't we used like 2 million of the 20 million artillery shells we have in stock? I'm pretty sure we just haven't shipped the rest yet. And then even if we do exhaust our supply, can Russia, the country, out-manufacture the rest of the Western world when it comes to artillery shells?
This is why the question for me always comes back to, it depends on how long the West is signed on to this struggle and how invested they are. Because long-term, all of the Western world, of course, could, if they converted enough factories and put enough potential to it, could outproduce the Russians. The question is, will the West care enough to do that? So far, they are upping artillery production, even if they're not nearly putting as much effort into upping artillery production as the Russians are, because the Russians probably they're putting in as much effort as they can. That is, not politically dangerous to Putin.
Yes, they are.
I don't think they can.
I think that's a very simplistic answer from Ryan.
And anti-air defense too, and like the F-16s, Syria.
So we're saying that United States, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and we're not just talking. We're talking Japan too, South Korea, Germany, because South Korea transferred over 500,000 shells to the American stockpiles. Germany, France, the United Kingdom, Spain, most of Europe, like all these powers. Like all of them combined, if they put their minds to it, could not outproduce the Russians. No, that's, again, right now, the Russians might have more capacity to produce that than many of these European states. But long term, if these European states dedicated themselves to it and the Americans did, that wouldn't be the case.
Syria shot down the F-16 by very well-trained pilots from the Israelis,
For sure.
with an S-200.
Yeah.
Now you have less trained Ukrainian pilots versus well-trained Russians with S-400s and above.
So
Well trained, I mean, it's, results may vary.
I don't think they're going to be a game changer either.
So
they're going to get shot down.
Yeah. So the difference with the Israeli thing is the United States is going to supply those F-16s with anti-radiation missiles that can fire at more than 60 miles. I think the S-400 is in deep shit, and they don't have any S-400s in country. They can't bring them in country because one of the problems is when you turn. That's what happened. By the way, I don't know if you know this. A lot of those anti-aircraft machinery didn't work. They never turned them on, and that's why they weren't able to defend that part of the country, because they weren't even turned on. Because one of the things that happens is if the United States is involved, or if U.S. firepower is involved, this is one thing we learned. This is what F-16 Wild Weasel does. Is
real quick, because we got to keep it focused, because we're going into this whole tangent here. He's basically saying that the sanctions are hurting NATO more than Russia, and you.
Yeah, no, that's just a crack of shit. Like if we go back to that point, that's just a crack of shit.
guys were saying you think the sanctions are hurting Russia more.
I definitely think it's hurting
Yes.
Russia more.
Ryan, what's your basis for saying that you think the sanctions are hurting NATO more?
There's
than
the cost
Russia?
of living going up in Europe. It's a matter. They need the oil. They need the gas.
But they were able to find alternatives. All of the disastrous predictions that were talked about with Europe, the brutal coming winter when Europe would freeze and cave to Russian demand, just didn't happen. The winter wasn't that brutal, and they were able to find alternative energy imports. Now, that doesn't mean that there's no economic problem with shifting on your energy supplier at that quick of a pace. Obviously, there was. There was a cost of living increase. But you're going to tell me that that cost of living increase was worse for the European economy than losing the access to the Western trade that Russia did? That 50% of government revenues being cut in half, that wouldn't have a more destructive impact on Germany than the loss of Russia as an energy supplier or any of these other European states? And Germany is a special case because they loved those Russian energy imports. I mean, Angela Merkel was really, really about those Russian energy imports. I don't know how it could base that off of just a cost of living increase.
The sanctions.
Because like a temporary cost of living increase in comparison to hundreds of thousands of your own citizens leaving when your nation's already in a demographic crisis, who knows if they'll ever come back? Some of them will when the war's over, presumably. Others, I mean, they might find themselves suitable to European or Georgian or Kazakhstan living. Who knows?
Are hurting them. And I agree with Andrei Martinyanov about GDP. Like, there's a lot of ways to finesse that stuff. Like, Russia and Mexico are not on the same level of living standards.
Agreed. No, I agree with that. Yeah.
Okay. And then what about you guys? What makes you think that Russia's suffering more from the from the sanctions than NATO is?
I mean, we're having energy issues all over the world. I don't know if it's just the sanctions on Russia that are dealing with that. My understanding is the cost of energy has come down pretty significantly in Europe in some ways too. Like, I think natural gas is about where it was prior to the conflict, I think.
Okay.
I'm pretty sure Russia can to say that like GDP means nothing. Maybe to Russia it doesn't, because
Didn't say nothing. Just that I don't think quoting GDP. I mean, like, that's the economy. There's a lot of other factors that judge the economy.
But it's also the wealth that the government has with which to fight a war. Their war chest is a taxation of GDP. That's why I bring that number up.
It depends. Like, also, I don't think, like, we have an enormous military expenditure, more than like the next 40 countries combined.
Correct.
Or something.
Just so you know, it's 800 for us, and then 290 for the next is
10.
China. Then after
Right.
that is Russia at 80.
But how cost effective is a lot of our military gear? Like, a lot of these
think it's pretty
Lockheed Martin products. I mean, you're talking about a $500 million F-22 Raptor with Sidewinder missiles.
Yeah, it's a great.
Should it be that price tag?
Sure. It's a really great question. And so part of the reason why we've been able to take away some of that cost is because we sold 200 F-35s to NATO. And so the
I was
cost,
going to say, when we say, is it worth that price? The rest of the world seems to think so, because everybody
buying
wants to
them.
buy our F-35s. It's a very highly in-demand plane. So it seems to be that everybody else in the world agrees that that's an incredibly cost-effective weapons platform. Maybe some people don't. Maybe Russia says it's not. But Russia, again, they also said they have hypersonic missiles, which are being intercepted by Patriot missile systems. So
Well, it's cost effective. It depends on like what you want a weapon system to do. If you're like a small country who doesn't have really many geopolitical threats around them, I don't know if you need to make the investment into the F-35 program, right? I don't know if Gambia necessarily needs an F-35 program, right? Maybe a different type of fighter jet program that'd be less expensive and less exclusive, and you would have to jump over less hurdles to get to, would be better for you. But the F-35 is an effective aircraft, yeah. And the F-16 is an effective aircraft.
apparently that's not
They
the case.
blew up the Patriot system in Kiev.
So here's the thing.
They might have blown up one of them when they launched what with the.
They blow up the Patriot system in Kiev. As far as I know, they didn't. I know that there was some damage to the Patriot, but as far as I know, within 24 hours of that damage, the damage was fixed, and the Patriots are still active. But there's only 2 in the country. And those Patriots have shot down Russian incoming armaments, whether it be like drones or rockets, stuff like that. But as far as I know, they didn't. When he says blow it out, that makes it sound like you destroyed it. Like if you damaged it and then repaired it and it's back out into the field, it wasn't blown up. Like no one would say he blew up my plane and then I repaired it. Well, how do you? If it's blown up, it sounds like it's utterly destroyed. You know, I don't pop a tire on my car and say, my car blew up.
6 missiles at once, I guess.
There's only 3.
Such a great point. So here's what
Those missiles shouldn't ever be intercepted, though, by if it's a true hypersonic missile, which it's not, right?
So let's talk about this. For those of you who understand, Patriot missile battery, it just fires anti-air. It takes on missiles from the opposing side, but it's ballistic, it's kinetic, it doesn't have a warhead in it. It just goes through it. In this case, what you're talking about, the Russians said they damaged one of the Patriot missile batteries.
I think Ukraine said they had it online that day.
Yes,
yeah.
and
within 24 hours. Man, I can't believe I remembered that. All the news developments constantly happening.
And the Americans and the U.S., the Western media agreed that that's what happened. That's why I actually trust what I'm hearing more from them than what I hear from Russia, because what I hear from Russia is that they have hypersonic missiles, and then when they don't work, they arrest 3 of their missile scientists the next day for treason. So,
well, I don't know if that was tied to the hypersonic missile or not. I don't know if that was. I mean, people speculate, but we don't know for sure.
To me, this just feels like, from a military standpoint, if you
Mr. Gamoto, thank you for the 100 bits. Even if the blew up part of the Patriot system, it wouldn't matter that much because it's 16 different parts. Oh yeah, because if someone says blew up the Patriot system and you blow up like the transport, whatever, it doesn't matter. Like they put it, according to the Ukrainians, and I haven't seen any evidence to the contrary, or the Russians haven't provided any evidence to the contrary. They never provided any footage of it getting destroyed or anything. As far as right now, as far as I know, that Patriot system that was damaged is back in use and was back in use within 24 to 48 hours. So yeah, I don't know if blown up would be the best descriptor. If I said, Zelensky just blew up, and then he's like, oh yeah, stubbed my toe. Hey, I'm gonna have to rest on it for 24 hours. Now I feel like maybe I've been sold a false bill of goods here.
You want to make a moral standpoint, I can understand, but from a military standpoint, this just feels like one cataclysmic failure after another.
Okay.
I think that's
and I'll even critique Mike because you kept saying it was maybe bad statesmanship to say that they weren't going to invade and then invaded. I think the initial plan was there was never going to be an invasion. It was going to be the special military operation into Kiev.
Sure.
Then they were going to have Belarus 2.0, and then they could have said we never invaded. It was just a thing, but that failed miserably.
You believe that Putin believed that he was going to be welcomed coming into Ukraine?
I from what I've read, I guess you're the military analyst guy. Yeah. From other military analysts, is the readiness of the Russian military.
Oh, is this guy a military analyst? Okay, well that makes sense why he knows a lot more of the history than the average person.
Military was just not where anybody in Russia thought it would be. And they were undersupplied, they were understaffed, the supplies they did have weren't maintained, and that what you had was a bunch of unaccompanied armor, uncoordinated troops that were.
I'm happy that Fresh and Fit brought on a military analyst. It didn't just have it like, so we have Destiny here, going to defend Ukraine. We have Ryan Dawson, somebody who's been focusing on geopolitical issues for 20 years. Not Ryan Dawson, but Ryan, what's his name again? Is it Ryan Dawson? It's something like that, right? Yeah, it was like Ryan Dawson, I think. And we have this OnlyFans girl who doesn't know anything about the war whatsoever. Like I'm happy they didn't do that, because just knowing how a lot of these podcasts go, that was a possibility.
Launching horribly coordinated attacks, which they've gotten their shit together a lot better now, a war into the conflict. But yeah.
So there's an FSB report that was released that showed that they didn't know there was going to be an invasion. So that goes to your point. I've heard the same thing that you're saying. And the other problem
I predicted the invasion. Got it right.
Good. You were smarter than
even when a lot of people they're not going to do that. But yes, they are. I mean,
yeah.
I've been preparing for this for a long time.
All right.
Didn't
real
Trump
quick.
also as well predicted too? Trump? The invasion?
I don't know. Did he?
Oh,
I don't believe Trump predicted it. I don't remember that.
Some rants. Chris, should we look at them now or no? Or wait? Okay, so what I'll do is I'll read the rants, and then I think we're good here with.
Okay, we got 5 minutes left. We're in the final stretch, boys. Final stretch.
Unless you guys have any other disagreements on.
Can I be honest? I was expecting a lot more from Ryan Dawson. I was expecting a lot more because somebody told me that Destiny didn't do too good here in advance, and they wanted me to respond to it. I saw people in chat saying it too. They wanted me to respond because they didn't think Destiny did too well. I think Destiny did pretty decent. I mean, compared to the fact that he's sitting next to like a military analyst expert. So I don't know him, but being told he's a military analyst expert. And Ryan, I think he did pretty well. He said less than the other people, but that's not surprising considering he's not the expert in the room, right? He still did pretty good. And the other person at the end of the table did well as well, did good as well. I thought Ryan did honestly pretty poorly here. Obviously I'm biased against the Russian invasion because I think it's terribly immoral, but I just Like the 14,000 number is just an example of something that I thought was deceptive. I don't know. I expected more. He said he was tired at the start. Maybe this isn't him at his peak, but I expected more from Ryan. I just thought Destiny could have done better. Well, yeah, I feel like, of course, I think Destiny maybe could have known more and could have interjected more if he knew more. But thankfully, like, the Fresh and Fit brought on somebody else that, you know, is more familiar with the issue than Destiny, you know, in case Destiny doesn't know what he's talking about, because he's a streamer at the end of the day. He doesn't spend all of his time concentrating on this issue. But yeah, no, I expected a lot more, I guess, from this. I mean, it was still a interesting conversation to react to, and being able to react to new voices on Ukraine is always interesting to me. But no, I expected more from how it was described to me. Huh. Anyway, let's get through this last 5 minutes. Debate the guy, you're a Ukraine expert. I'll talk to basically anyone. If he wants to talk to me, I'd be happy to talk to him.
It seems like you guys agree on a decent amount
we do
on
this?
Russia-Ukraine thing, but
Can we do this? Can we all three have predictions? Actually, all 5 of us. Can we do predictions?
what you think's going to happen?
Yeah, I think because
This is a terrible idea. This is a terrible idea.
debate like this is different from the other ones. In this, there is a unique chance for us to be extremely right. So what you have a prediction? Well,
Yeah, I do actually. I think, personally speaking, Russia did what they had to do by going into Ukraine.
I agree with that.
However, at the same time, like, what they did is they caused an issue because now NATO's going to be all on their necks.
Mhm.
So eventually they either got to surrender or become part of NATO. And at that point, they're not going to surrender. So
Damn, NATO imperialist. NATO in Moscow. It's gonna happen.
And they've been offered to join NATO before. I think
And
during the Yeltsin
declined.
administration, they
Yeah.
did, and they declined.
they don't want to. So I think at this point where it's going, if they don't win, they're going to have to surrender.
What do you think, Stephen?
I don't see Russia making any more significant gains in territory.
The one area Russia's attacking right now is Kharkiv. They're attacking in the direction of Kupiansk because they need to take Kupiansk if they want to advance on Kramatorsk in not a suicidal manner. And they want to actually, like, encircle it more and do it in a way that would be more... They don't want a second Bakhmut on a larger scale where they're just ramming the city in frontal assaults, because Kramatorsk is even bigger than Bakhmut and has had a lot more time to entrench and build up defenses. And I was there a year ago, and they were constantly digging trenches, constantly building up the defenses. That's the one area they're still attacking, and they're making very slow marginal progress. But I don't think we're going to see the capture of any large major Ukrainian cities like Kharkiv or you know, Zaporozhye or anything like that. The only stuff that I think is more up for question, in my opinion, is when we talk about things like Kramatorsk or locations like that where we know the Russians want to capture it. We know that's a goal of theirs. We know Putin wants to capture the rest of the Donbass in order to try to save face politically. On top of course, the other interests involved, but in large part to save face politically. They don't want to turn to his population and say, oh, look at all the stuff we fought for. We didn't really get any of what we said we were going to do, but, you know, he doesn't want to do that. So I think the question is about, like, locations like Kramatorsk, and that's going to be an extremely tall order for the Russians, definitely as they're trying to stop counteroffensives in other locations, at least for the immediate future, unless there's some big changes in the future. So I don't think this is a question of, like, whether Russia is going to conquer Kiev or anything like that. I think it's a question on if the Ukrainians can push back these well-entrenched Russian positions and the will for the West to support Ukraine. These are the big elements that have question marks on them still. Because the Ukrainians have already shown that they can do counteroffensives and succeed in them, but under these conditions, we're still waiting to see.
Dawson is right in that the grind on the Ukrainian side is a grind right now.
For sure, they have
It's-
fewer people.
Yeah, and that the it's a war measured in meters and not miles in terms of captured ground. Again, from the military analysis I've seen, it seems like whether or not Ukraine can retake significant territory is going to come down to whether or not they have the personnel and they've got the supplies and they have the micromanagement. Right now, they have a really hard time macro managing all of their different forces together. That the Ukrainians don't have that wide scale discipline and training yet to be able to deploy.
This is a very Western, like, think tank answer. The type of Ukraine can't engage in American way of war. They can't engage in combined arms warfare. That is why they're failing. I think it doesn't address a lot of the questions of supply. If you don't, like, a lot of this combined arms warfare that is wanted of the Ukrainians, is heavily supported. Definitely, when you look at, for example, the liberation of Kuwait, air power, heavy use of air power, which is something the Ukrainians just don't have. They have, in comparison to the Russians, their air force is much smaller, has much less resources, and they're constantly getting harassed by Russian helicopters, which are firing just outside the range of their anti-air shoulder-mounted munitions and anti-air weapons that they could use to shoot them down. So it's kind of hard to engage in combined arms warfare if you don't have air superiority, or it's very difficult for you to contest the airspace with your own air force. The Ukrainian shoulder-mounted munitions have been taking out a lot of planes, but like the air support element, Ukraine's going to need a big boost in for the future. That's why the F-16s are always being talked about. I do think this is partially true what Destiny's saying, but I think sometimes that's overemphasized to try to cover up the fact that also Ukraine still needs more shipments of good equipment from the West if we really are going to expect the success that we are expecting of them right now in Kherson. They're trying to make do with what they have.
Deploy all of these different weapon systems and then make them work in a unified combat sense. Assuming that they continue to improve there, they have an unlimited...
Superpower Broadcasting, thank you so much for the primer, being stuff. It's 19 months. I appreciate it. How's it going? It's going pretty good. We're almost done with the segment. Thank goodness. Man, this was a long one.
Person from the West. They probably have an unlimited desire in their citizens, because I think Ukrainians want to fight to defend Ukraine probably more than Russians want to fight to do whatever they're doing in Ukraine. So I think that I feel like in a year from now, we'll have a pretty clear picture of what the time horizon is on Ukraine's victory. And I think a victory for Ukraine at the least includes recapturing the Donbass. I don't know about Crimea. I have a hard time believing they'll get that back, but who knows?
Myron, what do you think?
The Ukrainians define victory, including Crimea. I do want to make that point, that the Ukrainians have explicitly stated that for them, victory means the return of all their territory, including Crimea.
Who do you think, Sue? What do you predict? A year, 5 years?
I think Russia's going to hold what they got, and pretty much the Ukraine's going to be cut in half.
Oh, well, not half. I mean, you can. I mean, yeah, Chris, if you can show
roughly like
it's like 15%.
The entire eastern part of Ukraine will belong to
Chris.
Russia.
If you can show that,
I think.
Ghost Pengy, thank you so much for the 4 months of being sub prime. When he says the entire east, does he talk? Is he including Kharkiv, or does he just mean what they currently hold on to? I think he means what they currently hold on to. But I mean, people thought that when it came to the areas around Kharkiv, people thought that when it came to Kherson. So, I mean, yeah, that's far from a foregone conclusion. But that, for me, I think that's the best case scenario for the Russians. They get to hold on to what they got.
So that people could have an understanding.
I think they're decisively winning the war slowly but surely. And I think that at this point, Ukraine isn't going to be able to regain the lost ground, from the east.
Just so you guys see, that is before the war, and then there's the initial invasion. You see all the Sumy and Kharkiv have been taken by the Russians, and then this is the counteroffensive down there in the bottom left. So Kharkiv and Kherson have been taken back by Ukraine, and then this is where we are currently, right there with Bakhmut being taken by the Russians, and Mariupol is like far. A lot of people talk about the Mariupol thing. Mariupol is far inside of Russian territory, Russian taken territory.
I don't think Kharkiv was taken. It was surrounded. Sumy was taken. Kharkiv was never in Russia.
The
Kharkiv Oblast was a lot of the Kharkiv Oblast was taken, the Kharkiv region, but not the city. Its city itself was never taken, and the Russians made them pay dearly for that. A lot of shelling.
Commander in the Russian forces who put out an evacuation order. That's all I know. So again, we have the fog of war, but I've read a report that it was actually
and
taken.
Then you guys give your predictions that we're going to switch over to 9/11.
What is your prediction?
Oh, I think they'll hold the Donbass. They'll take Lyman. They may push up to the Dnieper. They're not interested in Western Ukraine, and Ukraine's going to run out of personnel. I don't think the F-16
push up to the Dnieper. Wait. He says push up to the Dnieper. He doesn't mean like... No, he doesn't mean like the entirety of the Dnieper River, does he? Because if he means the entirety of the Dnieper, then he means like they're gonna push to here. They're gonna take all of this. They're gonna take all of this and like this side of Kiev and like... Yeah, that's not happening. So when he says to push up to the Dnieper, I don't know what he... I mean, I could imagine like the Oskil pushing back to the Oskil River Like, this is the Oskil River. This is, and they have 100,000 troops here. I could see an attempt to do that, but all the way here. Yeah, I mean, good luck with that. I mean, good luck with that, considering how long it took them to take Bakhmut. For them to take all of that land, if we were to calculate it at the speed at which they took Bakhmut, what would that take? Like 60, 70 years? Yeah, no, that's if that's what he means when he means goes up to the Dnieper, like here, the Dnieper River. Yeah, no, I think that's like Gonzalo Lira prediction, if that's what he means.
Going to be a game changer. I don't think the Ukrainian counteroffensive or offensive has been successful at all. They're getting wiped out. They could sharpen their discipline.
I think he's not really, I don't know if he's not watching Russian Telegram or showing the other side of how the Russians are being hammered as well, but
be better at hybrid warfare.
we're at the last 2 minutes. I don't want to interrupt too much.
But Russian artillery has proven to be the king of the battlefield, and Ukraine doesn't have an answer for it.
All right.
Yeah, I think Ukraine is going to have an answer for artillery. I think they're going to have just as many pieces as the Russians are. My whole issue is this:
when he said up to the Dnieper, am I misrepresenting what he said at all? I just want to check with chat. I don't want to misrepresent what he said. Is that what he meant? I want to double check. Do you think that's what he meant? It's hard for me to think that somebody actually thinks that they gonna make it to that. I don't know how anyone could come to that conclusion. It sounds like what he said. That's what he actually believes. That's actually bizarre. That's actually bizarre. That's like getting like Jackson Hinkle ramblings. You're getting to that like level. But I don't know.
I think the only way this ends is at some point Putin is no longer the president of Russia. If that doesn't happen, then there's always going to be some level of conflict at this area.
If he was taken out, it would change everything.
There you go. So I think there's a high probability that they do things. They have what's called a Russian election where they push you out of a 4th-floor window. I think and I'm not.
That's another thing when we talk about this war. Putin is 70 years old, and he doesn't look the healthiest. This is the same thing when we talk about Biden and Trump too. Like, so many of the world leaders that are involved in this war and to some capacity are very old. And I'm not going to say they could die at any moment, but if I told you tomorrow that Putin died of like a heart attack or something, no one would be like, how is this possible? He was so young and spry.
I'm not hoping death on anybody, but if he leaves the country, if he goes somewhere else, I think what happens is the cost of this war and the unpopularity of it in Russia, immediately whoever the new leader is starts to secede certain areas of Donbass. Crimea, you're right, that has way more to do with their hold over the Black Sea, but I also disagree with the two of you. I 100% believe they intend on trying to take Western Ukraine. I think that they want to have a revolution in
I mean, I think the Russians want to take the whole country, and if they can, they would. I just don't think they can, and I don't think after 10 months of slamming into Bakhmut, there's really a lot of realistic talk in the Kremlin of taking Kiev.
What's the other country? Moldova. And in order to do that, they're going to have to connect those two pieces. So they're going to have to
Transnistria, I mean?
Yeah, Transnistria, right. Yeah.
So in order to connect those two pieces, they would have to take Odessa, not Kiev, which is something that the Russians wanted to do. And there was a lot of talk early in the war. Why do I have the mic turned around like this? Look like a moron. Something that they tried to do early on in the war was actually possibly do a naval landing, but that all fell apart once the war started to fall apart, and they started deploying Marines in Mariupol, etc. But they would, if they wanted to connect with Odessa, I mean, with Transnistria and the 1,500 Russian troops that are embedded there. For those of you who don't know, if you are curious, let me bring it up for you guys, because I assume not all of you know about the conflict in Transnistria. And I don't want to do a rundown right now, but there's this breakaway part of Moldova, which is in part kind of a breakaway part of Romania. I know, a little confusing, but in Transnistria during the break apart of the Soviet Union, this broke apart. There was some civil strife. I don't want to get all into it. Point is, it's not internationally recognized. It's prop up by 1,500 Russian soldiers who are illegally, technically under international law, staged in Transnistria, kind of holding a good chunk of Moldovan territory as this weird proxy state that's really covered in Soviet aesthetics. And some people believe that since Moldova is not, and I am one of these people that believes this is at risk, that since Moldova is not covered by NATO, that if the Russians were to connect with Odessa, or possibly even not connected with Odessa, that the future conflict could be a Russian invasion of Moldova. And considering the amount of corruption they've fomented in Moldova, and they've tried to pay off Moldovan politicians with literal sacks of cash, and that's been exposed multiple times, possible, some people have said false flags that have happened in Transnistria that could be used to spawn a conflict, there's less evidence of. There's a lot of fear that Moldova would be the next obvious candidate for invasion by the Russians. But that's what he's talking about.
I think they're going to try to start something there. And in order for them to do that, they're going to have to push further west. And I think one of the problems.
Also, there's a lot of Russian speakers in Odessa, so it aligns with that like Russian imperialist colonialist narrative of like liberating the Russian speakers.
Is because of the way Putin gained power and because of the popularity of his annexation of Crimea, the unpopularity of this combined with any kind of loss is in Russia, they don't have like peaceful transfers of power. I mean, I know between Yeltsin and Putin and they did, but I think he's in a way fighting for his life. And so because of that.
Hey, Russian moderate Dmitry Medvedev peacefully transitioned. Come on. Peaceful, loving, moderate Dmitry Medvedev, Christian man, godly man, man of Christ. There was a peaceful transition of power between Putin and him.
I think.
Come on, man. Very unfair to the Putin government. Very unfair.
They can't quit. They can't stop fighting, no matter to the point where it gets irrational. I think they can't. And the other problem, what I said before, is while you're saying that they have a personnel problem in Ukraine, on the Russian side, they have a materiel problem because China is no longer going to supply them with stuff. Now, they can still get artillery.
There is some stuff they're getting from China. There's a lot of like commercial drone stuff being sent over to the Russians. And they're trying to keep it on the down low, but it keeps getting revealed, like body armor shipments, drone shipments. While it's not the main things that the Russia needs, which are, artillery shells with a low dud rate, even though really they'll take any artillery shell, period. That's why they're taking North Korean munitions. There is still some munitions getting from China into Russia to be used against the Ukrainians. I even read a few months ago a report from Politico suggesting even some rifles had gotten over, but nothing on a large enough scale to really have a big impact. Nothing that would really change the power balance on the floor.
Shells from Iran, I think South Africa. There's a couple other countries that can give them the artillery shells.
Yeah, there was an accusation from the U.S. Embassy about possible South Africa facilitating Russian military shipments. And the ANC's opposition, the Democratic Alliance, I think they were making a big fuss about that. They were also making a big fuss about wanting the South African government to arrest Putin if he comes to South Africa, and so then Putin didn't come.
But the problem is, like I said before, this is going to be a serious problem, and I think the ultimate ending of this thing is going to be the end of the Putin administration.
Okay.
See you next.
Well, I expected more from Ryan, but yeah, I'm actually not too upset with how this Fresh and Fit podcast went. There were things that were said on it that are not true or were cherry picked and that were dishonest, but I feel like I got to get my piece out there, and I feel like a lot of it was countered at the time by people on the show. So yeah, I can kind of sit here and kind of nitpick about specific things or like narratives or narrative traps that we fell into. But I think I was pleasantly surprised by the performance of this military analyst. And Destiny did okay. Obviously, I think Destiny could have maybe spoke up more, interrupted Ryan's, maybe not interrupted Ryan more, but countered a lot of what Ryan was saying more. But these two people like concentrate on geopolitics 24/7. This is like I don't want to say a hobby for Destiny, but it's not his main focus. So it's not terribly surprising. It's not terribly surprising to me. Pretty mediocre convo. I guess for me, I'm kind of satisfied because anytime someone tells me like, Dylan, this person disagrees with you probably on Ukraine, and if you listen to them, they're gonna like shock your worldview. Like there's always a tinge of nervousness at like the bottom of my throat. Like maybe he will, maybe I'll find out that all my beliefs were like wrong. And I believe that's good to have that as a human being, to have that always, to have some part of you that's open to like being challenged and open to being changed and feeling doubt in your beliefs. But yeah, no, I guess I feel, if anything, I just feel reassured. I feel more reassured in my beliefs, and I think that's maybe why I'm taking more of a positive impact from this debate. I don't know. Anyway, that's enough of this.